We're on.
We are live.
All right. Thank you. Good morning, colleagues, friends, staff members, members of the public who will be watching. Glad to have everybody here today. I'm going to call this meeting of this budget retreat meeting of the Durham City Council to order at 9:01 a.m. on Friday, the 26th of February. And Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Mayor Schewel?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Johnson?
Here.
Councilmember Caballero?
Here.
Councilmember Freelon?
Here.
Councilmember Freeman?
Present.
Councilmember Middleton?
I am here.
Councilmember Reese?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. And I will now turn the agenda over to Bertha Johnson.
Good morning, Mayor Pro Tem, members of council. Welcome to our fourth budget retreat. I have to say, as you all espoused yesterday, I have enjoyed having these half days versus full days. It has allowed us to regroup in the afternoons and, follow up, provide some follow-up materials and questions and try to turn around information to you as soon as possible. So it's been helpful as well. It's been a bit of a challenge that we're not all in the same room to pass notes. And so it's a little lag time when we're chatting with each other when you all ask questions. So just bear with us as we go through the day. We have two items on our agenda today, two presentations, our 911 calls for service project. And as you indicated earlier, we will be trying to finalize at least a draft of the budget development guidelines this afternoon. We will start off with our opening remarks from our interim city manager, Wanda Page, unless you have questions about the agenda. Thank you.
Good morning. And Bertha and I did not coordinate our outfits, but I think we do both have on a black jacket and a red top. So maybe we did it in our sleep. But anyway, good morning, Mayor Schewel, Madam Mayor Pro Tem Johnson, City Council members, staff, and residents who have joined us. As Bertha has mentioned, budget retreat session number 4 has arrived, and it is the final for this series. On January 7th, during the City Council work session, you heard a presentation on 911 first responder calls for service. And at that time, our staff and our research partner, RTI, received initial feedback from you. During that time, I announced we would be scheduling our next more detailed conversation about this initiative during our budget retreat. So this discussion today will provide additional analysis and hopefully responses to key questions that you all have that will lead us to being prepared to advance this work in the city toward one of the first milestones, which is developing alternative response pilots. We've scheduled, as Bertha has mentioned, the next 2 hours to have these discussions. Monica Chaparro, still fairly new to City of Durham government, but an experienced, innovative public administrator who leads our Office of Performance and Innovation and is leading this work in city government, will be the one that's going to facilitate this discussion today with the Research Triangle Institute. Again, as usual, I thank Bertha Johnson and John and the budget staff for always developing and coordinating these retreat sessions, no matter what we may be facing or what we may be up against. They always come to the top. So I just want to thank them, pause and thank them publicly for the hard work that they do in the background to make these budget retreat sessions go so smoothly. Our deputy city managers, as well as our department directors, some are still here for these topics. And I thank you all for being here this morning for this final session as well, as you will be the leaders that have the power to make the ideas and the plans the decisions that are discussed and finalized today become the successful initiatives for our organization and most importantly for our community. So in our final session, as Bertha has said, she's used to doing it, but she will be standing there facilitating the conversations on our budget guideline process. And this is very important to us as it actually sets the stage for the very, very complex work that goes on between the times when you actually see us in front of you and you know, when the work is going on. So I thank her for having certainly the skill, the leadership, and ability to do this work with the council. So at this time, I will pass the microphone over to Monica and her team to get us started.
Good morning, Mayor, Madam Mayor Pro Tem Johnson, members of council. I want to thank Manager Page for such a generous introduction. Wanda has been such a supportive and empowering leader. Given her busy schedule, she still makes time to meet with me on this topic every other week. So we would not be where we are today without Wanda. So I want to say that publicly. Something else I would like to do during January 7th, I was able to say the names of my team members, but just a quick point of privilege, if I could have them appear, I would really appreciate that. We've gone through quite a bit of ambiguity with this project, and they've been right there in the trenches with me as thought partners. So if Christina Tooks, who's a member of the budget team and also serves as the police budget analyst, she's been so resourceful in helping us navigate and ask the right questions and connect with police department, as well as Anise Vance. Anise is the Assistant Director in Technology Solutions. Anise also serves as the Chief Data Officer for the city. He has been so resourceful as we hit sometimes challenging data questions and making sure we can keep with confidentiality requirements, but also get the data we need to do this work. And finally, Shannon Delaney, who's a member of OPI, who has truly been in the trenches with me, will answer my texts whenever I send messages with a new thought. She'll go deeper and actually help me put pen to paper. So this work would not be as good as it is without these folks. So just wanted them to be able to share their faces. Also briefly, I want to talk about our partners, if that's okay. Chief Zolis and Fire, we just added Fire because now that we're getting closer to pilot implementation, as you'll hear from RTI, in certain places, the fire department plays a role. Chief Zolis has assigned a resource from his department. Randy Beeman with 911. As you'll hear RTI talk, there are certain opportunities that we can do at point of dispatch. So Randy has participated in the meetings. He's also assigned a resource. And last, certainly not least, is Chief Davis, who truly walks the talk. She has made her department available to us. She has been a resource to us as well. So just want to thank her for her leadership and being just a phenomenal partner in this work. Let's see. So this is a significant topic, and we want council and our administration leadership to have informed discussions. And that has led to a lot of information being shared. So what I would like to do before turning it over to RTI is just take a moment, also for the benefit of the public, to really go over at a high level the information that's been provided, just to orient us to what's been provided. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. And hopefully you all are seeing my screen. Mayor, I see you. So if you could give a nod, you are great. So one thing that we did was we developed this overview memo that really talks about all of the various pieces that were included in the packet. This information public is also available to you now as well. The first document was a staff-produced document. There's been a whole lot of information given, quantitative and qualitative, and we wanted to try to string that all together to tell a story and put those bits of pieces together so that it become more clear of how you might use the qualitative and the quantitative to come to decision making. Something that we hope will be of benefit to you all. The final pages of this document, we've given a very high level overview of the 10 alternative programs that RTI will talk about in detail. Feel free to keep this handy so that when it gets to the point for us to have discussion, you can remember which program is which. The third packet really is, let's move you all out of the way, is the research packet. And this is includes all of the technical summaries that RTI has provided of the 10 alternatives that we will talk about today, as well as Shannon has worked with RTI to think through how we might go about inventorying the resources that we have available to us in our community. That's going to be a recurring theme that in order to implement any of these alternatives, it's going to be imperative that we have the resources to do that. So Shannon has given a lot of thought to how we can inventory what we have available to us. RTI has some focus groups with our police department. Again, we actually got this idea of a focus group from Chief Davis, and it's really been, I would say, a great source of information. So in this report, RTI has provided insights and high-level takeaways from those focus groups. The fifth piece of information is use of force, either city council or city staff. I can't remember, perhaps both. We were interested in understanding the police department's use of force over the past few years. RTI has summarized what they found in this report. And then lastly, or not lastly, second to last is the presentation, and I'll get to that in a second. But I did want to also highlight that RTI did additional analysis on call natures that we were interested in, also information on whether the public was initiating calls or whether police department was initiating calls. All of that information is shared in an Excel sheet that was produced by RTI. Lots of tables, lots of tables. So the hope is that if you have particular questions or specific questions, RTI will stand ready to answer those. But they did, in fact, do that additional analysis. And the last thing I want to highlight is Anis Vance and his team. They have created a website, a really nice website that includes that Excel document that I showed just a second ago. But this is where we will also centralize all of the information related to this project. We think this is going to be a project of interest for the public. So being able to house the information and the reports that we share in one place, we think is going to be really beneficial. So I'll stop sharing. So all of that was provided to City Council. So just to center us on what we're hoping to get from today's discussion is, I would say, two primary things. One, included in RTI's presentation, they have about 4 or 5 considerations for things that we want to hold in tension or understand better as we select pilots. We would like for council to either affirm that those considerations align with your values, amend those, add to those, but some discussion around those considerations. Secondly, we're not really asking you to pick a specific program from the 10 that RTI will present on, but if we could have some robust discussion about what elements or components from those programs that council's drawn to, that council's interested in, or conversely, some things that give you pause or give you concern, that will be helpful to us because that team that I mentioned earlier that consists of fire, 911, police, and the regular team, what we're going to do is take back what we hear from you all today, and hopefully you're able to let us know what you're leaning towards. And we're going to go back, work on some pilot implementation action plans so we can move from the research phase to more of the action plan. Consider what resources we have available to us, what state laws we have to follow, come up with an action plan, bring that back to you all sooner rather than later in a work session setting so that we can get to business on actually putting together some pilots. So that's really what we're looking for today. And lastly, before I turn it over to RTI, I've gone back and forth on what might be the best way to bring about a productive discussion, because RTI's PowerPoint is structured in a way they're going to present each of the 10 alternatives. And I've struggled with, is it best for us to follow our traditional format of holding all questions to the end? It's quite a lot of information. Or is it better to have an interactive presentation? So they present a program and then take feedback from council. Mayor, I invite you to give your feedback on that. Every time I have this discussion with myself, I arrive at a different recommendation. So I really would invite, if you have a preference on what might be the most productive way to have some good discussion.
Monica, I'll just offer my little bit of this year's experience on Zoom that might be helpful, which is I will tell you that I find it harder to have interactive questions during the session when there's screen sharing, because it's hard to recognize people. It's easy when we're in this, when we can see each other. So my suggestion would be maybe that after, if you want to have the discussion between the programs, that would work great. If we can move out of screen sharing to this format, and then you can recognize people.
Okay.
That's my thought. I think it's fine. I just think it's hard when they're screen sharing. That's been my experience.
Okay, so let's give that a try. I'll co-manage the time if it seems as though we're not going to make our way through all 10, or if council wants to talk about what was found in the focus groups. We can really do this collaboratively. We can manage the time. So Brian, having heard Mayor Schul's suggestion, are you comfortable with that? We would go through a program, take down the slide, invite any discussion from our council, and then move to the next one?
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think in terms of making sure we hear from everyone on RTI's team as well, being able to have dialogue in between the individual slides, I think that'll be very productive.
Perfect. So I will now turn it over to Brian, who has been a great partner at RTI of understanding the need to bridge research with some actionable data and insights. So I'll turn it over to you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Monica. Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, Madam Mayor Pro Tem and Council. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to discuss this today. I just want to say we've been honored to work with the City of Durham and city staff. They've been working diligently on this, and we're so impressed by how thoughtful and hardworking they've been with this effort. So humbled to be a partner with the City of Durham, and really excited to have the conversation this morning. So before I begin sharing the PowerPoint, I do want to introduce the principal investigators on this project, and that's Dr. Kevin Strom and Dr. Renee Mitchell. I'll give them each a moment to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the PowerPoint.
Great, thank you, Brian. So hi everybody, and I've met some of you before. I'm Kevin Strom, and I direct our Center for Policing Research and Investigative Science at RTI. And as we mentioned before, and as Brian mentioned, really excited about this project. We're really excited about the partnership we've developed with Durham over the years, and that RTI as an institute has with the City of Durham. So just very excited about this work and looking forward to today's discussion. Renee?
Hi, I'm Renee Mitchell, and I'm the other co-principal investigator on the project with Kevin and Brian, and thanks for having me today.
All right, thanks so much all. I'm going to share my screen. And Mayor Schul, are you able to see the screen? Perfect. All right, so today we're going to be talking about some of the work that we've done to date and where we're going in the potential path forward. And I'm really excited to have this discussion, so we'll get right into it here. So I think Monica did a really nice job of summarizing all the work that's been done to date. We're really trying to make sure that this initiative is informed by the research and also understanding what is out there in the current field of practice. So I think in a lot of ways, Durham and the other cohort cities are blazing a path here, but there is some precedent to some of these things and things that we can learn on and build upon in the future. So we're not necessarily starting from scratch with a lot of this effort. And I think as we move into the implementation phase 3 of this, I think we'll have a really robust and well thought out plan for what it looks like moving forward. So again, just quickly, summarize some of the work we've done. We've done quite a bit of qualitative analysis. We did the focus groups and the discussion with the clinician. That was really a fruitful conversation. And we've done a lot of quantitative analysis. If you've seen in the Excel report that was sent to you all, there's many, many tables, some of which include crosstabs that might require a little bit of interpretation. So if there's any questions about that, either within this meeting or afterwards, we're happy to set up a time to talk through what some of those things look like. And then I think some of the other things that we're really excited today are plans for inventorying the resources in the community and with city services. I think it's really important to note that the success of these alternative responses really relies on having a good understanding of what resources exist to make them feasible and make them successful. So I think the city's done a really nice job of thinking through that and bringing stakeholders in from 911, police, and fire to make sure that we're having a really good sense of what we're doing and what is available in the city. And then I was really heartened to see an email from the mayor about the better defining and identification and documentation of mental health. We'll get into it later in this presentation, but we certainly know that relying just on the call nature related to individuals in crisis and acute mental health crisis, it's certainly an undercount. We know that from the focus groups, and we know it from some of the other analysis that we've done. So we'll get into the rest of that now. And then, so I will pause after this slide, and so we can have some discussion. But as we were working through the development of this PowerPoint, we thought it was useful to kind of frame the discussion around these considerations that we think, having seen and examined the field of practice in other areas where alternative responses have been implemented, we think these are the things that just should be satisfied, and we can have a discussion about that. But the first is we're looking to reduce negative police public contact and pair the appropriate response resource with community need. So I think we've talked a lot, and we've heard anecdotally from focus groups and from others that the role of law enforcement in the United States over the past several decades has expanded tremendously, and they're being asked to do things that sometimes might not be at the core of what they're traditionally tasked with. I think the second consideration is that it must be operationally and fiscally efficient. A lot of these things, at the end of the day, they have to be able to be supported by budget, and they have to be operationally feasible. So the third is that we need to meet community expectations for how 911 calls are responded to and resolved. So I think we'll talk about diverting non-urgent calls for service to other responders and what the potential for that looks like. I do think we need to consider, as we go through this, what the community expectation is. Even though there's not law enforcement action taken on some of these calls, it's still important to understand whether residents feel like they are either used to or are comfortable with a law enforcement response. And so we do have a consideration and a plan to address that moving forward. And then the last two, we believe, are important from a public safety standpoint. First, anything that we propose must meet the legal requirements of state statute. And lastly, it must maintain or even promote public safety. So with that, I will stop sharing I'm gonna have paused the share. Are you all able to see that?
Actually, Brian, I was thinking there's a closing slide with these same considerations. It might be a more productive conversation if we revisit this at the end after council has had time to talk about some of the other programs in other cities. And we can revisit that at the end if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so right here we have some of the, let me move to the next slide. So the calls for service research. So we've done quite a bit of work in this area, and I want to give Dr. Mitchell a chance to talk about this further. But what we see in the literature is that residents have relied on law enforcement responses for similar issues for decades. So many of the issues that communities are encountering now, these are not necessarily novel issues. And much of the research is focused on the types of interventions that exist rather than the basis of the call. And clearly one of the findings is that solutions are implemented without having the resources. And that's why we think it's so important to have the inventory of resources assessment happening concurrently with any of the development of alternate intervention strategies. And so Dr. Mitchell, I will give, would you like an opportunity to expand on any of that?
So this slide is really about when we looked back at the research over the past several decades, it really shows the same thing, is that, even from the 60s and 70s, before we had 911, but when they were examining calls for service and what officers were doing out in the field, they were still dealing with some of the same issues when it came to mental health issues, when they were, dealing with social disorder, when they were dealing with these type of social support kind of issues. And when we talk about, thinking about solutions and not having sufficient resources, they talked about both then and now that officers are really kind of backed into this box of there's limitations when it comes to ordinances or statutes within the city and the state. And then also that they are confined within what resources are available to them within their city. And so oftentimes they're limited, or I shouldn't say limited, but they're working within these boundaries of how do I solve the problem in front of me with the limitations that I have. So that's when, as you'll see through these slides, when we get to the very end, that's why we have that doing the review of resources, doing the review of statutes. So that way, when we're thinking about doing interventions, you're thinking about, okay, what do we need or what gaps do we have? So that way, if we're creating interventions, we're not just, recreating the wheel and placing the officers in the same box that they already live in because they don't have the resources that they need, or there's limitations by the statutes that are already present. So because we've already seen these for 5-6 decades, so we're trying to think outside of that, like how to really do this thoroughly and thoughtfully rather than just repeating what we've done for so long.
Thanks so much, Renee. And so there is a body of literature of 911 call for service research, and we know that calls tend to cluster in socioeconomically disadvantaged areas, and the majority of calls are not for things related to violent crime or even property crime. The majority of calls are for assistance or general assistance in some sort, traffic or the regulation of interpersonal conflict that's not necessarily rising to the level of criminal conduct. And and as we conclude the review of the research, we'll pause and let folks from the city ask any questions of that, but there's just 2 more slides on the research. So Renee, did you want to talk a little bit about the law of crime and concentration and some of the association with calls for service disorder and how that affects the community and manifests itself in terms of public health outcomes like depression and PTSD?
Yeah. So, and this is more of the newer literature. So beginning in 1995 with Larry Sherman and David Weisberg, examining where, calls concentrate. And they've shown both here in the US and other countries that calls for service and crime generally concentrate in a city. And most cities will show this level of 50% of a city's calls for service will concentrate within about 5% of a city street segment. And that means like intersection to intersection. So even, you think like all your city street segments aren't equal, but if you just think like streets, intersection to intersections, that's roughly your street segments. And those concentrations, this is a phenomenon that you see, repeatedly throughout other variables, not just crime, but it's also with repeat offenders. It's also, so they say like people, place, and property. And then also if you think about not even with offenders, but also with certain populations. So sometimes you see this with, you could have a group of elderly that could become victims, or certain types of high utilizers of the 911 system. So often when you're looking at where things concentrate, it's not the idea of this predictive policing and trying to focus on a certain type of, this group or this population. It's more thinking about problem solving. For example, there was research done about like high utilizers within the city of Camden and their medical facilities, and how there was about 1,000 people that generated 30% of their costs. And so it's looking at, what kind of medical issues are they having, and are there other resources that they could be diverting these people to rather than ER usage. So it's not a matter of like, punishment or, focusing on people in a negative way. It's more trying to figure out how to focus resources and the correct resources towards a group of people that they'd be better served. And then also just recently, David Weisberg had done some research centered around, coupling a mental health clinician along with an officer in these high crime areas, because we know that high crime areas come with higher rates of depression, higher rates of PTSD, to see if one, they could improve, outcomes for the communities, but also the relationships between, the police departments and the communities. And they did show it improved the relationships, because the idea was you can't really do one without the other. If you're trying to improve people, like a community's mental health outcome, you can't expect their mental health outcomes to improve if they're still living in a community where they're, fearful of violence, where they have drive-by shootings, or there's a lot of social disorder on the street, where they still, are uncomfortable walking to school or uncomfortable, walking to the grocery store. So the idea was the mental health clinician, their focus is on the public health side of things, and the officers' point of view was to focus on public safety in that, problem-oriented policing, like neighborhood type of focusing on how to make the neighborhood safer. It wasn't a, like an investigative type sanctioned focus. It was much more of a community service. How do we improve the outcomes of the community type focus? And they showed that they had good improvements. Only one study, but it was an innovative approach of trying to couple those two outcomes together and see how you improve both outcomes in a high crime, high, calls for service area.
Thanks, Renee. All right, so this is the next slide on research here is just framing how calls are resolved. Most calls do not result in arrest, and we saw that bear out in the analysis with the city of Durham. And most calls require the officer perform some sort of support role rather than an adversarial process. And we'll keep coming back to this theme that the officers are working within the structure of organizational restraints and state statute and organizational policy. And they have to do that while trying to resolve issues without necessarily resulting in a punitive outcome. All right, so this is the slide related specifically to mental health calls for service. That was an item of discussion that we had in the initial meeting. And I just want to have Renee briefly review this research. And then after that, I will take down the screen sharing so we have a chance to have a little bit of dialogue ahead of going over the technical overviews and the nuts and bolts of what some of these interventions look like.
This slide mentions the Boston co-responder model, but it's mostly about, the discussion centers around not the lack of, but where we miss out on mental health calls for service because they don't come in as a mental health call for service. So in this piece of research, Melissa Marabito was reviewing the Boston co-responder program. And that was one of the things that they noted initially was that mental health calls don't really have a good method for like labeling or coding those calls. And that's what that first bullet point, the Council for State Government in 2002 also noted that. In the Boston co-responder model, they had them labeled as emotionally disturbed persons. But if the primary call didn't label the call that way, then they had no way to track the primary nature of the call. And that's what we're also seeing with the seven cities is that, and this is, I would say, true for every police department across the country. If the primary nature of the call isn't mental health, it doesn't get tracked that way. And we all know that there's different types of nature codes that come out as a trespass. It could be a social disorder. It could be a suspicious person or a suspicious car or any kind of those calls where a citizen is seeing something, they're not sure what they're viewing, or it could be even a welfare check. Like they see somebody who seems to be emotionally upset, or they see somebody who appears to be passed out. But once the officer gets there, they're noting that it's a mental health issue, but it might not elevate itself to a level of being an involuntary commitment. So the call might not get changed to a mental health call. And what we're doing is we're losing that data in there. So that's why we're in some of these talks, we're thinking about like, how do you go back and either capture that data or make some changes in how we capture that data within the CAD system so we have better tracking of mental health calls. But this isn't just so nobody feels bad, like this isn't a Durham issue, like this is a national, I would say, issue across the country.
Yeah, thank you so much, Renee. And so we will speak in detail about a plan. We have two different paths to get a better understanding of the prevalence of mental health calls in Durham's 911 data. But I did want to frame the focus groups. So we were able to conduct focus groups, speaking with line patrol officers. So these are either patrol officers or first line supervisors who are answering 911 calls, their primary function. So the focus group report gave an overview of some key findings. Some of those findings included the openness of officers to a co-response model similar to the one that they're currently having with the one embedded clinician. And I think we hope that the focus group provides some context for the findings that you had. So I know some of the initial feedback on the quantitative analysis was some surprise at the amount of, or the prevalence of mental health calls. Officers were saying, that there's between mental health and substance abuse, and it accounts for a much higher proportion of the root cause of the call than is reflected just in analyzing the call nature alone. So we thought that was really important. So I will stop. And the last thing I did want to mention about the focus groups is those focus groups are indicative of officer perceptions. So there may be things there that are inconsistent with what is your reality. For example, I understand that many of council members, if not all, have participated in ride-alongs. Many of the officers in those focus groups were not aware of that fact. So if there's a disconnect between your experience and the experience of the officer, I just want to remind everybody that those focus groups are really a reflection of what the officer's perceptions are. So let me stop sharing, and I will turn it over to Monica and council to see if there's any questions at this point.
Great. So if there's no further questions or you want to have conversations about what was shared in the report, we don't hear any, we will move right along.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions, please, or perhaps one. That's right, Madam Mayor Pro Tem or Mr. Mayor, who? Okay, thank you.
I'm Monica is in the driver's seat.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Madam Monica, forgive me. 1,000
I
pardons.
like that. I like the sound of that.
Absolutely, it sounds good. Appropriate. So thank you so much, and to our friends at RTI for just the enduring and fruitful partnership you've had with our city over the years at critical junctions in our city's development. I'm glad to see that you referenced Boston. In 2015, I was dispatched to Boston as part of a city mission to look at the way they integrated kind of creative approaches and alternatives into policing across a wide range of areas. And I remember specifically having conversations with police command staff about being more effective in responding to mental health issues at the street level. So it was good to see that. I wanted to ask, in your slides, the one who says who calls 911 and how are 911 calls resolved, it was a bit tricky for me to delineate between when you were talking about national kind of findings and what is germane to Durham, specific to Durham. For example, I guess when you say where do 911 calls concentrate, use of city services concentrated among people, places, and property, is that kind of a universal, general kind of thing? And how much of this is about Durham?
That's right. It's a good question, sir. And so the findings that we are presenting are representative of a national scan of the literature. For Durham specific information, we would have to go and refer to the short report with all of the tables. So for example, the 20% that was cited, that's in the literature if you wanted to know specifically for Durham, we could give the exact numbers of that. And we also do have a resource. I know that there was a question about the spatial distribution of calls, specifically a subset of certain calls. We do have some maps that could be made available to council that show the spatial distribution of that. And we also have the geographies down to the beat level within the data that is in the short report.
Right. And what kind of questions were asked in the focus groups? I'm glad to hear that our officers were open to being partnered with other helpers. I've done several ride-alongs, and you're right. There is a perception that us electeds are kind of out of touch. And I'm obviously I'm not going to name officers' names who I spoke with, but that was I've done a number of them. That's been kind of a prevailing kind of motif, that the belief that we're kind of out of touch and don't know what happens at the street level. So I'm glad to hear from your research groups, your focus groups, that there's an opening, or at least an openness to having embeds, if you will. Could you what was the dynamic of the discussion? What kind of prompts were used in the focus groups, if I might ask?
Yeah, of course.
Just briefly.
Yeah, so the overview of all of the discussion guide is included in the packet. It's towards the end, it's buried in there. But some of the questions we were asking are, what are the types of calls that you feel least equipped to respond to? What are some of the biggest misconceptions of the job that you're asked to do? Are there resources available that you use as alternatives to enforcement? Those were the types of questions that we were asking to understand, how potential interventions may work. And I'll note that at the council and mayor's behest, we spoke with the embedded clinician at DPD, Abena, and I just want to say that I came away unbelievably impressed with her professionalism and what she offers to the residents of Durham. And an overview of that interview is also included in the packet.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I think with the leadership we have at DPT, particularly with the chief and her command staff, I think you're going to find yourself impressed over and over again with the openness and an alignment with our values and an openness to our values here in Durham. That's all I'll do for now. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Monica. I yield back.
Thank you, Councilmember Middleton. Any other questions? And I did look, Councilmember Middleton, it's on page 13 if you want the guide. I also want to say, in this public square, to use your terminology that I always like, staff, we did not attend those focus groups, and that was really intentional. We wanted police officers to feel like they were in a safe space, whether it was to critique staff. So we did not attend those focus groups, and that was very intentional on our part.
Got you. Thanks so much for that.
Mayor Schul.
Thank you so much for this. And second, what Councilmember Middleton said about our appreciation of our great partnership over the years with RTI, especially on these policing and public safety matters. We really are grateful. So, I noticed in the report that the biggest recommendation of the people in the focus groups was that council members take ride-alongs. And as you say, a lot of us do take ride-alongs. And I agree that they're super valuable. It's an interesting question about, I do think that if our police force knew that, they might be happy, that we were doing that and getting that direct experience. I'm not sure exactly how we would accomplish that. And also, sometimes it's a little tricky because we're not doing it because, we want them to know that we're not doing it for PR. We're doing it because we're trying to learn, at a very, very granular level, what's going on. And it really is super helpful. I mean, one of the things that I appreciate about what you've done so far, just what we've seen so far is and what was it, in your reports was the work you've done that both in the officers' discussions in the focus groups and what you all have confirmed in the research really confirms the discussion we had last time about the fact that the undercounting of the calls related to mental health issues and crises. So I appreciate you all digging deeper into that. That's been, I really think that's been already just in what you presented, very beneficial and important. So yeah, I think those are my thoughts.
Great. Not hearing or seeing Mayor, I now understand how difficult it is to scan to see if others are asking to be recognized. But I don't think anyone else is asking. Something I do want to offer, you may remember this time last year, budget staff, we did tabling in the community as a follow-up to the community survey. And some of the things we heard from the younger folks, you might remember the people we engaged in that effort were folks who typically don't engage with us as much, people of color, younger folks, homeless people. And something that came up in those interactions last year, we're hearing from teens who did not appreciate when police officers got involved, like the parents would call the police on them just because they were having a dispute. So when I saw that in the focus group, that our officers always also feel like that's a space where they may not be the most appropriate resource, I found that to be validating, because we also heard that from some of the teenagers and young folks that we talked to this time last year. Something else that stuck out to me in that focus group was animal calls. And in the summary document that Shannon and I prepared, it's almost like 3,000 animal calls, and our police officers noted they feel as though that's beyond their scope of work. So I flagged that, I put a pin in that, because at some point we're going to want to bring all this together to say, now, what do we do with this? How do we make changes for the future? So those are just some observations I would add. So, Mayor Schul.
You made me think of one more thing, Monica, which is what you just said, and what Dr. Agard has been saying, and it's really interesting to me the extent to which what we have been saying and hearing in the community about the police, about not wanting to have police responses to all these things, is exactly what those police officers were saying to you in the focus groups. I mean, there wasn't a disconnection, and I think that's great. And I think it gives us a real basis to build on when there's a lot of common purpose.
I agree, Mayor. We all know I'm a fan of triangulating data. So when those different data sources support and align to one another, that really does help us feel more confident about decisions you might make in those spaces, because we've heard it from different audiences in different ways. So I do want, and we'll continue to flag those as we go through discussion. So Brian, I'll turn it back over to you so we can continue our journey through the PowerPoint.
Yeah, so this is a perfect segue. Let me share my screen again. All right, so I'm in complete agreement in terms of making sure that there's harmony between the expectations of the community and what the law enforcement agency feels most equipped to respond to is vitally important. And I think one of the things that we can do a better job moving forward, and we're recommending a potential pilot in this area, is doing a better job of leveraging the existing calls for service database, the computer-aided dispatch, to better define, identify, and document mental health. So there's two paths forward here, and there is a technical overview that goes into detail about how this would look. But in general, there's two overviews. One is a retrospective analysis, where we would use artificial intelligence and natural language processing to review the notes within the 911 call notes field to see if we can get a better understanding of what proportion of calls may have an underlying root cause related to individuals in crisis or less acute mental health. And then the second would be the modification of the existing practices in CAD to better document that. So rather than relying on call nature, there's either another field or some sort of structured text that would go within the call notes so that we would be able to better identify which calls were related to mental health. So one of the striking findings that we had when we were doing the analysis is, so Durham Police Department currently does have a CIT team and a clinician, as we noted. We looked at calls with a closed code that were closed with a referral to CIT. And just over half of the calls that are referred to CIT which means that the officers believe that the person they're responding to would benefit from somebody with more experience with responding to individuals in crisis. But just over half of those call natures were not related to mental health. There were things like disturbances, general assistance. So we know that we're undercounting how prevalent these things are. We just don't know how much of an undercount it is. And I think better understanding what that true prevalence is vitally important when considering what these alternative responses look like and the focus. I think some folks may look at the data and say, when only roughly 2% of calls initiated by the public have a mental health component, that might not seem like it warrants an alternative response. But we know from what we've done in this phase of the project, and not only in Durham, but as Renee noted, nationally, we're undercounting it, and we need a mechanism to do better. So we do have those potential pilots that we are suggesting that you all in the council at least consider. And Monica, before I take the screen down, I'll defer to you. Do you want me to go through the next slide before taking my slide down, or the stopping to share the screen, or does this warrant conversation just on this topic alone?
I think going to the next slide, I do want to interject on this slide, though, for council's benefit. That team that we pulled together that consists of Randy from 911, police, fire, we've already started talking about, and we don't want council to get in the minutia of this part, but we've already started talking about what this could look like. What are the processes that would need to change to do a better job of tracking it? And there are some barriers, but we are committed to, if this is an area where council says, yes, we want you all to focus on this, we are committed to finding solutions to those barriers. But the team has already started talking about how we would do a better job at this.
Madam Monica, if I could, I actually, it would be helpful to me if we could just stop here for a second. I recall a number of times when I've hung out in firehouses with some of our firefighters, the CAD system that's in these firehouses, and the incredible amount of information that they're getting, as they're rushing to the truck before they leave the house, from smells in the house, whether it's gas or whether it's oil, how many people, and this constant flow of information. So I know that our fire department uses the CAD system, and I was just really impressed with the information. I'm wondering, and I heard you reference Chief Zoldos being involved earlier. So I'm wondering if we already have those on ramps, or at least have the skeletal or the architecture anatomy in place to incorporate that in police calls. The other thing, what intrigues me, when you say only 2% of the calls initiated by the public have a mental health component, and we know we're undercounting. I mean, to me, and what I've heard from officers when I've done ride-alongs, what this speaks to is that's really the nature of the whole business. You never know what it's going to be. And when you arrive, you think it's one thing and it's something else, whether it's, mental health or whether it's whatever. So this really, to me, speaks to just the incredible number of unknown variables that we're asking these people to respond to, which is why I think I said in our last discussion that I think it's important that as we move to policy and implementation, we have a menu of options that's robust enough to respond to all of these contingencies, which puts me on a trajectory to having, favoring officers that have CIT training with embeds as well. So we're not in situations as a city where we send out one particular team and then they've got to wind up calling for the other team anyway. And that time can actually be life threatening. So having a robust menu of options, precisely because if this 2% of calls is an undercount of mental health issues, then that's got to be applicable to all other kinds of calls as well. What we're undercounting. That's just the nature, I think, of the work. So this is very helpful to me. It's only, stabilizing and kind of concretizing my view of why this work is so important, but also why it's important that as a city, in terms of service delivery to our residents and citizens, we've got to have a robust and varied menu of options to respond to all contingencies, because you just don't know oftentimes when you get there.
Monica, if it's all right with you, may I respond to that just quickly? Okay, so yeah, sir, it's a great point. And there's 3 different points of intervention for these alternatives. And there's varying amounts of information at each point of intervention. The least amount of information is at point of dispatch, where no one's arrived on scene and ascertained what's going on. The second is responding to the scene traditionally, but then making a determination for an alternative response on scene. And then the third is not responding in the acute time of crisis, but following up with these folks after the fact. So those are the three different points of intervention. And as you move from one end of the spectrum to the other, it goes from less information to more, but the amount of time that you have to respond it increases. So I actually, if there weren't any other questions, we can start to get into those menu of options that you mentioned there.
Thanks much.
Brian's trying to take my spot. I'll do the scan, Brian. City Council, anyone else want to chime in? Mayor Pro Tem, I see you've made yourself visible.
Thank you. Yeah, this is super helpful, the breakdowns of each of the individual call types. And I think that the mental health and the quality of life calls, I mean, we know just from talking to people that those are a much bigger issue than I think the data initially showed. So it's good to get a little bit more of a drill down. And I think that it makes sense that we would be undercounting the mental health calls because the mental health issue is like, it's an underlying condition. It's typically not the direct result of the call, but it's it's the underlying condition that results in the call. And so figuring out how to count those is a real tricky both data and policy problem, and thinking about how to count them and how to respond to them. So yeah, it's really helpful to have this information. It was really interesting to me overall how few of the calls to 911 actually relate to crime. That it's something like 20% of 911 calls are actually related to some sort of criminal activity, and 80% of them are just things we've decided that the police should do. And so I feel like there's a lot of room for us to make significant changes about what we expect police officers in Durham to be doing versus other folks who could be employed by the city in various capacities to respond to nonviolent issues. So yeah, I'm really interested to dig. I didn't get a chance to really dig into the big data, so I'm excited to do that a little bit more. But yeah, I feel like this puts us in a really good position to think about shaping what the pilots look like, what we have now.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Any other members of council?
Monica, if I might, Mayor Pro Tem actually jogged something in me. I think what she says is really important. I think there was always a danger, if you will, and that might be too strong a characterization, but a risk at tethering policy movement to what we find statistically. I always thought this was really more about values and just an embedded approach, meaning that if there's one life we could save because we had this apparatus in place for the city, that was the threshold we needed to cross. So for me, there was never a threshold, a percentage or a statistical threshold under which, okay, we don't need to do it. Because as you talk to people, as you listen to people, you know that we need more responses that result in less Black and brown people getting killed for ridiculous reasons. I don't care what numbers we found. We needed to do this and change this. Because for me, if we're undercounting, mental health issues, then 20% of calls for crime, I mean, we could be undercounting that too. I mean, we can't just kind of pick where the statistics work and where they don't work. Because I know that, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't get called in. For example, gun violence. Every night in this city, there are guns going off that are not counted. We know that. We know that a lot of people have just resolved themselves that there are certain quality of life issues in their neighborhood that's just part of living here. And they have, and that's where some of that PTSD comes from. We have kids, well, it's not even post because the gunfire is still going on. We have kids experiencing PTSD every night in our city that's not getting captured by 911 calls. That's not being captured. So across the board, statistically, you can pick an area. I'm certain we're undercounting in a number of things. So for me, this is about values. This is something, a shift we need to make, a reconfiguration of our response protocols because one life is worth it. You know, no argument's going to suggest to me that, well, because we didn't cross this threshold, we don't need cahoots or CIT or mental health responders. We need to change the way we respond, particularly in communities of color. So for me, this is all very helpful, but this is only giving resolve to my belief that this is something we should do, notwithstanding what we find statistically, because we know we are overcounting in a whole bunch of areas, particularly when it comes to the most underserved and marginalized communities in our city and indeed in our country. So I'm excited. I just wanted to add that. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Councilmember Freeman and then Councilmember Freelon.
I think both Madam Mayor Pro Tem and Councilmember Middleton covered it. That was.
Okay, Councilmember Freeland.
Thank you, Madam Monica and Brian, loving the presentation, ready to jump back in. I just had a really quick question, or I guess comment maybe. So when we do that I know you were kind of offering it as an option, but I was really curious about the retroactive mental health crisis algorithm, where we go back and look at the previous data and assess what we may have missed that may have been a mental health crisis. And I wanted to kind of volunteer or offer as a framework to the RTI folks or whoever will be doing this research that, and this kind of goes to what Mayor Pro Tem Johnson was saying about underlying issues, like, you know, there might be some things kind of really deep in the notes that, you know, speak to underlying issues like bipolar disorder or depression, or as Councilmember Middleton said, PTSD. I think applying a really broad lens to what a mental health issue is that could be a contributing factor to the call would be really important, and not just kind of like some of the more obvious smoking gun things like a CTI reference after the fact. And so I'm not a researcher and don't have those competencies, but would just want to offer that as a framework to consider using really kind of broad strokes and as we put those algorithms together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's one of the things that we encountered in the research and noted, and Renee, I saw that you came on. One of the things that we realize is we don't want to undersell the challenge that's associated with doing that and better documenting calls related to mental health. It is difficult enough for a clinician in a controlled environment to identify some of these underlying causes. And we don't mean to presuppose that just us doing a scan of call notes that we can necessarily derive the universe of folks that are experiencing mental health issues. So Renee, I'll turn it over to you.
And I would say what that looks like in my mind, and we haven't broken this down yet, and we've talked about doing this with you know, one of the other cities also, but we look at this from a couple different frames. So you have to think about, there's a legal framework for the state of North Carolina and like what makes for an involuntary commitment. There's a medical framework for like what is a mental health disorder versus like something like a brain disorder, where you have like your dementias and your Alzheimer's, right? And then you're gonna have things like mental health issues. So the way I see this in my head is I think we'd probably look for the largest universe of what we could in the calls and try to pull them all. And then I think we would probably break them down within that large universe and then see if we could somehow frame it. I think the exciting thing is I don't think this has been done in the field before. So I think a lot of this would be really exploratory. So I think to maybe set your mind at ease, we wouldn't be trying to narrow this first. I think we would be trying to go at this broadly and then trying to see what all of the information brought in, and then trying to see how within each of these different frameworks, and then also what's out in the research field, like what fits within each thing, and then really exploring those calls. So I think one, this is really novel research to do, but I would say we would come at it much more broadly than narrowly. And I see Kevin now turned his video on too.
Yeah, so just one additional point, and yeah, Councilmember Freeland, it's a great point, and that's exactly how we've been thinking about it. But I did want to just mention that these two approaches that Brian put up there they're actually complementary to one another. So we could do this sort of retrospective, and then also, like Monica mentioned, permanent way of tracking this. But they actually could complement each other. And I totally agree. The idea is not to try to use the call notes to diagnose some type of particular disorder, but to try to sort of take this broader approach, and then in the follow-up response to the call, then maybe we can figure out, could there be an assessment process that occurs at some point. So this is something that we could go back in time with, but then we could also use moving forward. So I just wanted to add that point. Thank you.
And Councilmember Freeman has a comment. Before we get to you, Councilmember Freeman, I just want to, both Dr. Mitchell and Brian have referenced the other cities. So I thought it would be good to remind folks that we are doing this as part of a cohort. And those other cities include Rock Hill, South Carolina, Town of Cary, Raleigh, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and Burlington. So all in all, about 1.6 million people live in these cities. So we're not doing this journey alone. So I think there's going to be a lot of value in that shared learning. Councilmember Freeman.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And along those same lines, I just wanted to caution how we hold this conversation in context, acknowledging that being Black in America is not mental illness or trying to associate it with mental illness. It's actually like the effects of being Black in America might create some post-traumatic stress, to the comment that Councilmember Middleton made. And so just being careful about how we frame this, because it does feel a little off-putting to say that, that the mental health calls or the notes or whatever. I appreciate, I think it was Brian who was deciphering between the mental health diagnoses versus a legal kind of framing. And so just acknowledging, even when people talk about people with being without homes, having mental illness, it makes me uncomfortable, because just acknowledging that being in this country with capitalism and all the many things can create really sane ways to deal with it that aren't what society expects. And so just being careful that we don't box people into those categories with that kind of cure violence mentality.
All great comments. Thank you all. It looks like we're good to move forward in the PowerPoint. Just doing a time check. I think we have a little less than an hour dedicated and lots of slides, but I think this is fruitful discussion and a really significant topic. So we can keep going, and then I'll look to the mayor to decide what's the best way to proceed. But Brian.
Okay, thank you so much. And we can start to get into the approaches, and we can go over the approaches in kind of groups. They kind of self-sort. But just one point before we get back into that, Monica, I would never be so delusional that I think I could replace you in your role or your job. So you're certainly safe in that capacity. All right, so the first thing that we want to say is we realize that we're going to need a customized approach for the city of Durham. There are alternative responses that we're going to provide an overview of here in the next several slides. But all of those interventions and alternatives exist within the context of the community where they're implemented. There is no one-size-fits-all approach that would work where we could just take something from a Eugene, Oregon, like Cahoots, and without doing some substantial work in the interim to implement it within Durham. We know that, so it's just something we want to frame for you all as we're reviewing these. Think about the components of these things that you like, or the things that you think would really work for the residents of Durham within the context here as we go through the next few. So for these alternative strategies, the first ones that we're going to overview here are related to having a crisis worker or clinician respond. And so we'll go over those and then have some discussion of it. And so just for the sake of time, maybe Renee, can you give maybe a 1 minute overview? I know you've done a lot of research on Cahoots, and there's a lot of context that folks are not familiar with if they're just relying on information that they're finding from Whitebird Clinic.
So the Cahoots program is separate from the police department, but they do work in conjunction with the police department. So there's a lieutenant within Eugene PD that has, weekly meetings with Cahoots and attends their meetings. It's dispatched through their 911 system, and they pair a crisis worker along with an EMS worker. But within that context, the Cahoots is within the Whitebird Clinic, and the Whitebird Clinic is a larger clinic, and it's been around for 50 years now. So when people think about Cahoots, sometimes I think from the media, they get this idea of, I'm just going to put a crisis worker and like an EMS worker in a van, and that's like a Cahoots program. But the Whitebird Clinic has a medical clinic, a dental clinic, a substance abuse clinic. They do a lot of outreach within the community, and they've been around for a long time. So the community really knows a lot of the calls that they make into, they have a non-emergency number also, not just 911. So a lot of their welfare checks that they get, the community knows they're not calling the police. They're calling in saying, hey, there's somebody, passed out on the corner. Can you send a Cahoots team? So they know that they're specifically calling in for Cahoots. I think a little bit of the story that's been put out by the media that gets maybe not portrayed correctly is the amount of calls that are being diverted that would be police calls. So Cahoots actually does a subset of calls that police wouldn't respond to, which are your transportation type calls. So they'll go out and transport somebody to, if they want to go to a substance abuse a meeting, like an AA meeting, if they want to go to get something to eat, if they need a ride across town for some type of, appointment to get ID or things like that, that they need help with services, they'll give rides. Also wound care. So if they have addiction issues and they maybe have like an abscess, an untreated abscess, they'll go out and do wound care. So they do a lot of work outside of policing. So I would say they actually like increase your calls for service, but they're providing a service beyond what police also do. But there is also that overlap with the mental health piece that had Cahoots not have that program within Eugene, the police department would be responding to. And those are, your mental health type crises, your some of the homeless population, those welfare checks, those are the type of calls that the police department would be responding to. So when you look at the overlap there, what Eugene PD, their assessment is they probably divert about like 8 to 10% of their calls per year. But if you talk to Eugene PD also, like they have a very good relationship with the Cahoots team. They're appreciative of the work they do. It's not work that Eugene PD wants to be doing. And they believe like it's a good program within their community, but it's very well supported by the Whitebird Clinic. So it's not just a two-person, 2 people in a van without all of these other resources. Cahoots works because it's in the middle of this big support system, I think is probably the most important thing to understand about Cahoots. And it is one of the programs that actually does not have any type of research around it. There's no process evaluation or outcome evaluation that's been done on Cahoots so far.
All right, thanks, Renee. And so there's a few here that just for the sake of time, these are similar. I will point out that each of these has a technical overview that goes into great detail. So just at a high level here, Home Team this is an effort, I believe, Renee, this is out of San Francisco, is that right?
Yeah, it's out of San Francisco.
Yeah, and the idea is to reduce the amount of EMS related calls, and hopefully that would reduce some future call types that may be responded to by law enforcement. But again, this is another alternative response for non-law enforcement EMS calls in an attempt to decrease future reliance. Oops, wrong direction. All right, CAMP is a component of LAPD's SMART initiative. And the kind of novel thing about this is that this is going after a very focused group of individuals. And I know, Renee, you've talked to the folks out in LAPD. Can you give just briefly, in maybe a minute or so, an overview of how camp is a little different than some of the other responses?
And sorry, before you chime in, Dr. Mitchell, because I have Brian on high alert now. I had our end time wrong, Brian. We have until 11:30. So
Oh, okay.
I could sense that you were picking up the pace, and I appreciate that. But we have until 11:30.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Perfect, because every time Brian says 1 minute, he knows that I actually talk too long. So the camp intervention with LAPD, and this is one of those interventions where I think it's one where I think it's a good idea for LAPD. I don't know how transferable it is to other departments as a specific idea, but I think that there's components of it which I think are a good idea. But what it is what LAPD was trying to do is really look at high risk individuals within LA who they thought might have potential use of force incidents that would turn out poorly. So when they were evaluating individuals they were dealing with in the public, they were looking at people who were doing attempted suicide by cop, or who had barricaded themselves, or who had had a mental health crisis but had had a weapon, or a mental health crisis and had been threatening either to the officers or to the public. And the unit consisted of a clinician from the Department of Mental Health within LA, and then a detective, and then it was there was a sergeant that ran the unit. And the idea was that they were trying to get resources connected to this group of people so that their mental health crisis did not escalate into some type of use of force. They really wanted to see them get linked up with some type of services because they didn't want them to spiral down into some type of critical incident. So, but this was also, LAPD has a mental evaluation unit. So once again, camp is embedded within all of these other triage. They have a triage unit. They have these other units that support camp. So camp's not just this one program all by itself. It's positioned within these other area, or these other co-responder units, and within mental health clinicians. But what they're really trying to do is focus on preventative interventions to reduce these high risk individuals that they think might have potential for negative use of force incidents.
Yeah, thanks so much, Renee. And Councilmember Middleton, when you were speaking earlier, this was the intervention that came to mind as you were describing the needs of first responders in Durham to be responsible for some of these populations that are potentially at risk for use of force incidents. All right, and LEAD is out of Seattle, and similar to some of the other interventions focused on mental health. It's trying to improve future outcomes by diverting low-level offending. And so, Renee, did you have anything that you wanted to add about this one that was different? And I think, let me check the next slide. So that in crisis interventions teams, which are incredibly common, and Durham has a very high proportion of officers that are CIT trained. Between those two interventions, Renee, did you have anything that you wanted to add? Because I think that would be and we have co-responder. So the co-responder model is where you're pairing an officer with a clinician, and that's also something that Durham has now. So between LEAD, and LEAD is a type of co-responder program, do you have anything that you wanted to add to that, Renee, or do you think it's appropriate now to take the slides down and have a discussion about some of these interventions aimed at improving outcomes for individuals in crisis?
Just on the LEAD, because that one is focused on more of your low-level offenders overall. It's not just a mental health program. So that is trying to decrease recidivism rates for any kind of homeless-related offenses and any prostitution, any low-level drug offenses. So it's much more holistic, and it's an effort both by the district attorney, the police department, social services, and the defender's office. So, and there's been no randomized controlled trial of the program, but the research that's been done on the lead programs, both in Seattle, and there's been a couple replication programs in Contra Costa County, and I think there's 2 other replication programs. They had at least high-level evaluations of the programs, and they show that that there's some lowering of recidivism, but there's also improvement between communications between the groups, which I think is also a positive outcome for the program. And then the other thing, when we talk about, the culture of policing and, what we're trying, like, I can't remember which council person said it, but the values and the goals of a city, they talked about that the police officers had a different point of view. It changed their outlook about the population that they are working with, in a positive way, that they were becoming more empathetic and more compassionate towards these group of people. So I think sometimes, besides looking at like crime outcomes or culture service outcomes, those are also outcomes to think about, is that you're changing, the culture of an organization potentially, and you're changing the culture of how these groups work together. So that's what the LEAD program is. You're really getting that group of people, the prosecutor's office, the police department, the defender's office, and the social workers to all work together and to be working for a common purpose, which is to reduce jail time, to reduce recidivism, to reduce, a pipeline into prison. So it's got really good, it's got good potential, I would say, from what I've seen.
All right, thanks so much, Renee. And Monica, if you think it's appropriate now, I will stop sharing my screen because there's a lot of information and folks can have a chance to react.
I think this is a good pausing point. Some things that I would just like to add. One of the insights from the focus groups were that officers were interested, or they noted oftentimes they don't know what happens to folks once they make that referral to CIT. They don't know what's been done for that person, what's really the issue. Another thing, LEAD, some of the initial reaction from the team is that some of those partnerships have been activated with some of the city's other really progressive social justice programs, like the Welcome Home program, where we work with probation, where we work with the district attorney's office. So some of those relationships have been activated. So that's something we talked about within the team. But yeah, we would love to hear from council. Any thoughts on those first sets of programs that Dr. Mitchell and Brian have discussed? Councilmember Middleton.
Thank you, Madam Monica. Well, if I can channel my inner Yogi Berra, we resemble that statement rather than resent it. As I listen to these initiatives, I brag on the city a little bit. There's going to be a really robust plausibility structure already in place, I think, in Durham. The number of officers that are CIT trained, our work in diversion program, misdemeanor diversion program. We do work in eviction diversion as well. The leadership, the cultural changes that our command staff at the police department have instituted. So I think the ground's going to really be fertile for some of these pilot projects. As I listen to these, though, I'm wondering if we should have heard the use of force report before we got into the initiatives, because one of the questions is, and I was the one who talked about the values, just kind of as making this a value tenet of our police department, notwithstanding statistics. But since we are having a statistical conversation, since we've rooted it in kind of empirical evidence and stats, it would be interested and understand the context in which I'm about to say this next thing. What are we fixing? How many police involved shootings were there last year? How many use of force incidents were there for DPD, not some composite of a nationalized picture of a boogie police department that we're warring against. Now, I'm an elected official in Durham. How many use of force incidents did the DPD engage in that turned out to be bad because it was a mental health issue? Because how rampant is that in our police department? Because some of that, since we're having a statistical based conversation, some of that might inform which one of these initiatives, or a composite of them might be best for our city. But I see the seeds of many of them already in place in the culture of our police department, policy wise, from other departments. One of the coolest things I've done since I've been in office, and a couple of our colleagues were there, I had an opportunity to give greetings to one of the CIT graduations at the Department of Health building. This is pre-COVID, of course. And I was just really impressed with the number of our first responders, not just LEO, law enforcement, but medical responders as well, and firefighters that were getting CIT, crisis intervention training. So I see the seeds of this, many of these already in place, which bodes well for how we're going. But I think it's going to really be important to have an unflinching look at how pervasive the issue of use of force against folk who needed actually to talk to somebody is in the DPD. And that's going to help me, I know, as I drill down on some of these initiatives. So for whatever that's worth, but this is great. So I really appreciate the
that's worth a lot. Councilmember Middleton, would you like us to pivot to that report? We have it. I pulled it up in the background, and just the quick glance at this report again, 174 calls from 2017 to 2020 involved a type of use of force. And it's a spectrum of what use of force is. That's new to me. When I think of use of force, I think specifically of guns, but reading our general order for DPD, it can be different types of restraints or such. But if the will of council is to have a deeper discussion on use of force right now, we're more than happy to pivot to that. So
yeah, I'll yield to the mayor, or I wasn't trying to divert. I was just saying for me, in holding them in tension, what would be good for me, but I'll certainly yield for direction from the chair.
Mayor Pro Tem Johnson.
Thank you, Monica. I wonder if you're the right person for this question, or maybe Bertha or Wanda is, but I'm wondering what decision we need to make today. Like, what is the outcome that y'all are looking for from this discussion? And that would help me a little bit with figuring out what to say next.
Oh, yeah, I think that's completely fair. I'll offer my thoughts, and if Manager Page or if my boss Bertha has a different opinion, please chime in. What we were really looking for are components that you're drawn to. So if you like the fact that lead is an after action, so definitely picking up from Councilmember Middleton, holding in the tension that we don't know what happens on a call. So he might be drawn to alternatives that are after more intensive follow-up rather than in place of. So things like that, knowing what elements or components you all are interested in, those considerations that RTI placed up and in the beginning of the meeting, making sure that those are the right values or considerations. And if there are certain values that you all have that you want us to bake into a pilot, voicing those, because what we want as our next staff action of staff is to start implementing or putting together these implementation plans for a pilot. And to be able to do that, we really need to know what you all value, what you want to get out of a pilot, but not necessarily, oh, we want lead or we want cahoots, but what elements you're drawn to.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Well, my boss did show up, so she might have a different opinion. So let me just check in to make sure that is fair.
I do not. I agree with what Monica said. I just want to emphasize those key considerations that we all leave this discussion being collaborative about how we agree to those as we move forward. I think even that would be beneficial to the team. as well as what Monica mentioned about giving us some guidance on those aspects of these ideas or initiatives that you would like for us that you have a strong sense about wanting us to move forward on, but at least agreeing to those key considerations, I think, Monica, would be at the very least what we need from the City Council.
Great, thank you. Yeah, well, there are 7 of us, so there's probably 8 opinions. So I feel like I should turn it over to Mayor Schul to figure out how you're going to facilitate us through that conversation.
Well, my thought would be, Monica, that I'm sure that all of us are working towards that as we go through the programs. You've got still a few more of the programs to go through. And so it might be helpful to, this is my suggestion, go through the slides. Tell me, you're going to do the use of force presentation. Were you planning to also present the use of force information or just the slides?
So initially we were not, but we knew we needed to remain flexible.
Yeah.
The goal of this is to get you all what you need to give us what we're asking for. So we can definitely pivot to going through that use of force if it's helpful.
My thought would be to go through the slides, continue through the programs. Let us respond to those, because I think that will give you some of the information that you want. That is, what are the values that we see in here? What are the particulars from some of the programs that we see in here that we like, that can give you some guidance towards the pilot? I think it will be useful to have a summary of the use of force report, which is not long, which is good and interesting. And to me, the most amazing thing about it was, I don't have these numbers right, but 930,000 calls and 174 use of, the percentage of use of force incidents is minuscule, which to me in itself is very interesting and kind of thought-provoking. So maybe the way to go would be to go through the slides, have some response about how we responding to these programs, then go to the use of force, have some discussion of that, and then maybe you'd get your takeaways.
Sounds like a great game plan. So Brian, we'll have you bring up the PowerPoint slides. We'll work our way through all of the remaining slides, then invite council's feedback on the programs, and then have RTI give a summary of the use of force.
Great. It sounds like a plan. Thank you so much, Monica. So this is moving in a little different direction now, and this is something that we want to highlight our partnership with the University of Chicago Health Lab. They do a ton of work in this area that's focused on diversions in the 911 center. And as Monica alluded to, we had a really fruitful discussion earlier this week with some of our partners in the city of Durham in the 911 Emergency Communication Center. And one of the things that we were discussing as a potential pilot is this concept of diversion at dispatch. And we really think that there's potential there, especially given the environment with the pandemic, to have folks get the resources and the solutions they need at point of dispatch for certain types of calls. And so, Renee, I'll turn it over to you to give a overview of that. We do think that this is something that has some potential, especially in Durham.
So point of dispatch diversion can be done in quite a few different ways. And this is actually, some of the research was, I think, from the 80s when we had the large budget cuts and recessions. So they were looking at it more from a city perspective of saving money, to seeing if, citizens were okay with having, instead of having a police officer show up, if they were okay with somebody taking, a report over the phone, or, setting up a time for an officer to go out. And some agencies now are looking at even having something like a or a nurse practitioner in the 911 dispatch center to handle some type of calls. But this is one of those ideas that I think you could get really creative with when looking at the type of 911 calls that come in, because a lot of times, depending on what they're calling about, if the goal is to reduce, police citizen contact There's calls that come in that could be possibly handled over the phone if you have the right person trained. That could either be an officer or a sergeant if you have to have the right level of authority within the dispatch center, and or a well-trained city employee that understands like the city ordinances, the statutes, or has some legal background that could help walk somebody through, tenant landlord issues or other type of issues. So the point of dispatch diversion is really just an alternative crisis response. And even nowadays that, like I use the analogy of, before the pandemic, there was so many CEOs that were saying, we don't want our employees working from home because they won't get any work done. They'll be watching TV all day. But now that we've gone through COVID, we realize, employees could get a lot of work done at home. This might be the time to try to, seeing if we could handle calls over Zoom, that if people, depending on the type of calls they have, and when we think about, like, to put a caveat in there, when we think about 911, it's not like I'm not talking about like emergency type calls where it's like they need a police officer, they need a, EMS there right then. I'm talking about the type of calls that are some type of dispute or some type of ongoing issue where they need help or the support, like the social support, where they need somebody to help them with their problem, but they might not need somebody right there, right next to them. So it might be a way of introducing like a Zoom type call or a FaceTime type call, and people might be more open to it now that they've had, we've been through the pandemic and realized we could accomplish a lot doing things this way. So there's a couple different ways to do these things, and based on your calls through Durham, we could look at which type of calls we could do an alternative dispatch, and then also look at if citizens are comfortable with some type of alternative dispatch. And later on in the PowerPoint, we talk about a possible pilot is asking citizens, like, if you had the opportunity, are these types of alternatives, are you open to this? And this is something that was within the research that they did when they were starting to look at these alternatives back in the 80s. 4 different agencies across the country did surveys of their citizens to say, what are you comfortable with? Just to get an idea before they started with an alternative type of dispatch. And it sounds like, just like most, human beings, that if they know what they're in store for, they're pretty comfortable with new ideas.
Yeah, thanks so much, Renee. So and that goes back to the point Renee is making there about making sure that community expectations are met. So we're excited about the potential for this one. And I just want to point out that, so Randy Beeman made the observation that this is something that they've been considering some years back, the concept of having a nurse practitioner. So when the call is coming in, instead of referring them to EMS or fire or law enforcement, there's this other resource. It's a virtual resource, it's remote, but it's something that could really serve their needs and reduce the burden on folks in field operations. So we're excited about the potential of that one. And so in a similar vein to the point of dispatch diversion, there are other non-urgent call types that can really be satisfied with a non-in-person law enforcement response. And there can be a lot of them. So one of the insights that we had from the data is so that over 10% of calls in Durham that are non-police initiated are alarm calls. So the 3-year analytical period, we're talking right around 57,000 alarm calls. And of all of those calls, only one of those resulted in an arrest. So this is where I think there needs to be a conversation about expectations and what folks in the community expect. But just as an example here, the city of Camden, New Jersey, they will only go to an alarm call if it's been verified as a break-in by a third party. And that greatly reduces burden in terms of what the agency is responding to. That's not necessarily a recommendation. It's just something to consider with the data. So Renee, for the non-urgent calls, I think some of the things we can talk about are how technology can replace it. Chief Davis gave a great overview of the P2C, the police to citizen. which is an online reporting mechanism, which allows folks to submit reports that are official police reports without having to interact with an officer. So that's good for customer service and it's good for burden on the agency. So there are some technical solutions here, and we can identify which types of non-urgent call natures might be suited for a pilot in that area. But Renee, I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think the only caveat we kind of talked about for this one too was if there were any statutes that created limitations for, for Durham, because I know that's one thing within when Berkeley in California, when there was discussions about, creating a whole new traffic unit within a civilian traffic unit. I know within California, there's state statute that talks about that only law enforcement can enforce certain traffic laws. So I think that's some of the research or background information we need is to look at what types of things can be handled by certain groups of people. But I think there's a lot of potential for, civilians or other city employees handling a lot of these non-urgent calls, especially the ones that don't require law enforcement action. And I think those, especially as we start digging deeper into the data, because we've done, a good overview of what kind of calls you have within Durham, and now parsing those out. If this is, one of the things we want to look at, like figuring out within those call types, like which ones we want to maybe pilot a different alternative, wouldn't be too hard.
And I just want to remind everyone, we've done some of that in the summary document that staff produced. So if you go to like the traffic related summary, we talk about there over 4,000 calls were related to abandoned vehicles, and 82% of those calls were resolved without a report, and 13% were resolved with an incident report. So we have done some of that of trying to dig deeper into the specific call types. So I really encourage you all to spend some time with that summary document.
So, Monica, thank you for that. And if you think it's appropriate, these alternatives have a little different flavor. Do you think it's appropriate to pause for feedback?
I would say maybe, I see the mayor shook his head yes. So I'm going to say yes, this is a good time.
That was only because I had some comments and questions.
Okay. Would love to hear those, Mayor.
My self-interest got in the way of my good sense. I wanted to mention this after the first group, but what I want to say about the first group was I'm really glad. One of the things I think is so valuable about this report is that there are people in Durham who think about this, that all they think about is cahoots. It's all they know about. It's all they talk about. And, they write me and say, or write all of us and say, why aren't you implementing the codes program this week? You've put that in such good context. I mean, there's so much else out there, and I really appreciate that. I just wanted to express my interest and support for this alternative diversion at dispatch. I mean, I just think that's just such a, the idea of, and I had been aware of the fact that Randy Beeman, they've been thinking about having a nurse at the 911, and I think those kinds of things are so important. So yes, I mean, I know you're looking for opinions. That's one. I just think that this alternative diversion at dispatch is just going to be critical, and I can see it will be hard. You already mentioned some of the ways earlier that it will be hard to make assessments. A call comes in for one thing, it's really turns out to be for something else. And then the other thing that you've mentioned this several times, either you have, Monica, or Dr. Agard or Dr. Mitchell, that there's so many categories that you have in your summary that you just you could see, and Constance Stansel's probably on this call, and she might want to kick me after I say this, but No, I could easily see people from Constance's staff, being part of a response to an abandoned car. That we didn't have to send a uniformed officer who's going to create, potentially create some tension that we don't want to. So all those things seem really good to me. My question is about the alarms. Are the alarms all privately generated? In other words, are these people, is this like a business has an alarm? What is an alarm?
I was going to say, I need one of the smarties to appear.
Yeah, so we broke it down. I believe for this analysis, that's alarms of all types. So it's commercial, it's residential. So alarms of all types. And we did break down into the subgroups so you can see the difference between commercial and residential. But outcomes that lead to even documentation or a police report, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, exceedingly rare. It's like single digits.
Yeah. And so, I was amazed by just the, one arrest out of 57,000 calls. That does seem really make you want to question the allocation of resources there. But it's tricky because the whole, and so somebody's, I guess I'm wondering, like, somebody's paying for, I don't have an alarm system, but the idea would be somebody's paying for an alarm system. The alarm system somehow rings at the police department or rings at 911, or what goes on?
That's right. So so for example, if you have a residential, I feel like we're getting far afield here, but we'll talk about alarms a little bit. If someone activates the alarm in your home, it generates a 911 call. So a private company that is selling that is getting the government response of having police follow up on whatever activated that alarm in the house, which according to our analysis is exceedingly rare to be an individual.
Right. That was kind of my point. That this is being driven by something we don't want to be driven by. And so that's what I was thinking was going on. And thank you for confirming it. And that's my question. But this is just, all these things, the way you're cutting this data is so useful. So thank you.
Let's see, Councilmember Javier.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I have appreciated all the information we've gotten thus far, and we have a lot to kind of process and chew on. To me, it's, we're going to get to the use of force stuff in a minute, but for me, the biggest thing is a misalignment of what is actually needed. And are we using public money and public resources on things that could be done better, differently? And then, our goal as a government is to provide the best service, and use the best allocation of resources possible. So I think this alarm example is pretty key. I think that's a misalignment of resources. We do not need armed police officers dealing with that. So I really like this idea of, analyzing the call when it comes in. When I think about the conversation around, maybe there's a nurse practitioner that's handling some of these calls. People already do that. There's already a relationship with your doctor. Lots of doctors offer after hour, 24. That's something that folks are used to dealing with. It's not going to be a new kind of behavior that folks have to be trained on. We have called our nurse practitioner many times, which has kept us out of the ER. We have 3 kids. There's lots of accidents. So I think about, some of the things that folks are already used to dealing with that will help us, where we're using our police officers for the really important kind of violent crime that I think people mentally associate police officers with. With the kind of reporting, I think a lot of times, and I say this as well, people report things because they need the insurance paperwork, right? Several years ago now, somebody broke into our house, they shattered the glass door, they didn't get in. It was more a nuisance than anything else, but we had to report it because we needed to replace the door. And that was the way to do it. And so I think a lot of folks, that's how they approach it. They're just, same as police officers being forced into a box, often residents are forced into a box about how they're going to interact with public safety because of regulations and rules that potentially, can be handled and we can go a different path if we're allowed to. And I know that you all have mentioned state statute as a limitation. So I think, when we think about who's reporting to traffic incidences, those are things we will have to think through. But I just want to share my kind of number one, which is obviously we need, we know we have violent crime. I think everyone is aware that we want, we see a role for police officers in that element. I think as we deal with quality of life and mental health and some of these core root causes that cause a lot of trauma in our communities, the risk, the use and need for police gets diminished. And I think that's what I'm interested in really getting from these pilot programs.
It's very helpful. Thank you. Councilmember Middleton.
Thank you, Madam Monica. And I thank my colleague, Javiera, because I think she really, as she often does, and just kind of deadbeat straightforward ways, it's kind of crystallized what the issue is. So I want to honor her transparency with transparency of my own. So my question is that animates my participation in this conversation is, what are we trying to fix? For me, we're one of the best run cities in the country. We literally get awards for it. So this for me, and I'm not even gonna pretend it isn't a management issue, because if it is, show us where the money's being wasted and where the efficiencies are or inefficiencies are, and let's have our city manager's office fix it. Here's what I'm concerned about. My end goal is to have a cessation of Black and brown and poor people being gunned down by police departments because they have a mental health crisis, or being choked out, or having the crap beat out of them, or being tased, and then switching channels and seeing, white folk wilding out, spitting at them, having all kinds of crises, and surviving. That's what the issue here is for me. It is not an article of faith for me to diminish, or defund, or get rid of police, or that. The issue for me is Black and brown folk getting killed, and how do we stop that? So I'm not going to conflate that issue as an article of faith with the actual outcome that's important to the people I talk to and the people I'm accountable to. Stop killing us. If this is a management issue, then we need to address it as a management issue. This is a life or death issue. So the question for me, as an elected official in the city of Durham, not a national leader, not LAPD, Durham, how do we prevent Black and brown people from getting shot, beat up, tased, killed by law enforcement officers who are responding to something with force that does not need to be responded to with force? How pervasive a problem is that in Durham? And if that's what I'm trying to address. If there are some issues in terms of management, or we think that it's more appropriate or inappropriate for the police to go certain places, we can have that conversation. But I'm not going to do a disservice to the main issue or conflate the issues of how many of us are getting killed, which is why it's going to be important to hold this conversation in tension with the use of force statistics of the Durham Police Department. I am interested in addressing the issues of Durham, not a nationalized, disembodied kind of conversation about policing in general, which I've done. I mean, that my public portfolio and profile was built on dealing with those issues. But I'm talking about Durham today. And I think the idea of having the diversion at the time of the 911 call, making an assessment of what's a more appropriate response to send is a good one. And that actually, Mr. Mayor, was at that program that you alluded to was actually at the top of my list. But I don't know the one time that alarm is going to be violent. I don't know if it's going to be my house or your house, or I don't know whose house is going to be the person who wins the lottery that day. And that's actually the time that there is. I have no idea what that is, but it is not an article of faith for me that my trajectory here is not to deal with the diminishing the police per se as an article of faith in a number of areas where we think we can have management efficiencies bettered. My question is, how many people have died in Durham that did not have to die, that should not have died? How many people have been brutalized? How many people have been killed? How many people have been slammed up against a police car, tased, knocked upside their head, while watching other people who are not Black or brown get the help they need and survive contacts? That's what my issue is here. And all of these initiatives that we're looking at, and I want to be totally transparent, that's the prism through which I'm looking at. I think if we want to talk about management efficiencies, or whether or not we think that, the police should be used in other areas, then that's a discussion we should have. But when we're talking about folk who are having mental health crises and surviving police contact, I want to be very clear, at least for me, that I'm looking for ways to save lives. And I'm not going to conflate, the other conversations, which I'm prepared to have in the debate, by the way, but I'm not going to conflate that with, I think, the important task before us as a council to keep Black and brown people alive. And I think, for me personally, I want to be able to do that and govern a great American city and maintain the capability to respond to all contingencies, whether that's a brother or sister having a mental health crisis, or a couple thousand Proud Boys storming our downtown, because we're called to govern for those kind of situations as well. So I want a robust, as I've said before, my watchword, a robust menu of options and responses to respond to all things. We can keep people alive, and if we need to deal with management efficiencies in one of the most well-run cities in the country, I think we can do that as well. It's not either or for me. So I just want to put that there. And I do like the idea of the diversion at the time of the 911 call. Thanks.
Unmute. I see you, am I muted? Okay, I'm unmuted. I see you, Councilmember Freeman, but Councilmember Caballero, did you want to add? No.
No, not right now.
Okay. Councilmember Freeman.
Thank you. I appreciate Councilmember Middleton highlighting that specific point. I think that just being really transparent and saying that I think that the conversation around Black Lives Matter and defund the police have to be held in context. And I appreciate Councilmember Middleton noting that. Thank you.
Since I knocked us off course, Monica, I'm sorry.
No, we want this to be productive for you all. So that's
Okay.
what matters most.
All right. I know I opened the floodgates and couldn't help myself, but why don't you head back into the slides? I do think we have some time constraints.
Perfect. Yes, we have about 32 minutes to be exact.
All right, thank you so much. So this next overview, this is different. And we wanted to include it here because we think about these things comprehensively, and we want to make sure you're aware of things that are designed to really support the residents of Durham the best way possible. So just in the interest of time, and there's more information in the technical overview. This actually comes from the UK. Renee, can you give us a real quick overview of how this is a little different than the other interventions? It's not even necessarily related to 911, but is designed to support residents in our communities.
Yeah, so this is, like Brian said, it's out of the UK, so they have a family liaison officer. So the UK policing really operates from a harm reduction point of view versus like a more American punishment point of view. And one of their roles that they have with their family liaison officer is in all major crime inquiries where death or extreme serious injury occurs, they have, these police officers that have been trained to embed themselves with a family. So that even means with a family that maybe has had a person within their family that's been killed by a police officer, they'll embed themselves with that family to help them go through everything to do with the criminal justice field. I know we have victim support services through the DA's office, but they feel like having somebody that is involved from the police department with the family helps the family like understand the whole entire process, because it is complicated. You have media, you have you know, a defense attorney, the prosecutor's attorney, you have victim support services, you have all these things going on. So to have somebody from the police department that just isn't there necessarily as, you know, to spy on you or do any of those things, but to really just be a support and a listening ear, they feel helps them with their, have a better relationship with their community. I wouldn't suggest like starting this with, you know, families that have had incidents with the police department. Like if this was something you started, it would be, I would say starting it with, you know, your families that have had somebody, you know, killed through other means. But the idea is that you're trying to get the family supports that they need so they understand the system, because it is very, I mean, if you think about it, it's very overwhelming. It's very complicated. There's a lot of things going on when somebody passes away or has been injured involving criminal activity. So no research on it. It's just one of their programs that they're extremely proud of. The officer that I spoke to still volunteers, even though he's retired, to train people on it. When they had the tsunami in Thailand, the UK sent their officers down to Thailand to help families and give them support with their officers doing outreach down there. So it's been run for the past 20 years, so it's very well embedded.
All right, thank you so much, Renee. And we know that one's a little different, but I do think it was useful to include. So I want to commend Shannon Delaney with the city of Durham, really thoughtful and put together a great inventorying protocol. You can review that, but the idea is that we're going to be systematic in our review of what resources exist. Having the meeting with all the stakeholders, 911, fire, and representatives from the PD is really helpful in helping us complete this. And working through some of the folks in CIT who were most familiar with some of these resources, we think it's critically important to have this done. You can refer to that document if there's questions, if there are potential gaps, please let us know, and we'll try to be as responsive to that as possible. So just briefly, there's some overviews here. As responsible researchers, we have to go over the limitations of the calls for service research. So I think this was a discussion that we had in the last time about the initial call nature versus the final call nature. And we understand that. The DPD provided a sample of their call data, and roughly 6% of calls that end with a different call designation than the first one. So that means the vast majority are being identified correctly with police communicators using their process. We've documented that the mental health issues are not necessarily as well documented within the CAD system as they should be. And we also don't know what community expectations are for some of these potentially non-urgent or diverted calls. So those are things that we would need to work through and that we would need to understand. And then the final thing is about call outcomes, and not necessarily knowing that just because a law enforcement action wasn't taken, we have to understand if the call was has a disposition the way that it did, because there was the potential for the application of law enforcement authority. Just important that we note that, and you know, it's a limitation of the research, and we want to be responsible and transparent about that. So we also want to say that it's important to verify information. So there's a lot of information about cahoots out there about how much the cost savings are. We've done some research into how that was actually derived, and it's not necessarily accurate. And we also hear a lot of times in terms of understanding what the prevalence of certain call types are within a jurisdiction. And I think that's why it was so useful to review the information and the data to say, you know, violent crimes or property crime, they're not the majority of calls that law enforcement is responding to. And we also want to understand, I think this is a good segue as we talk about the use of force report in Durham, specific to Durham, understanding the prevalence of those things as well. I think we can have a data-informed conversation about that. So I will turn this slide over to Renee. Renee, maybe in 2 or 3 minutes, can you just describe the importance of the need for evaluation and how that component fits into phase 4 of our project?
Yeah, so one of these things when we were reviewing like all of the literature, when they're evaluating the programs across, different cities across the US and even in other countries, a lot of times you could see where, in certain cities, they might have a different outcome than other cities. Sometimes it's a lack of program fidelity where, there were certain components of the program that just didn't fit with their city services or, there were issues with how they were embedded. For example, in the Boston co-responder program, they did their co-responder program within a Boston hospital. So the hospital was actually responsible for supplying the mental health clinician. One of the things is it went unfunded for, I think, a full year. And then finally, when it was funded, when they hired the mental health clinician, that clinician didn't fit with where he was placed in the north area of the city. They ended up shifting that clinician to the south area of the city, and they had a better culture there. From then on, they involved the officers in the hiring of the clinicians because then they felt that, having a co-responder program, you need to make sure that the clinician actually fits with the culture of the police department. But that's where you see when they do like an overall systematic review or meta-analysis of all the research, you often get these null findings of that these programs are ineffective or inefficient. And it's because you don't often have the implementation in every single city, or you'll have research findings. For example, in Akron, in one of the programs, they had an increase in arrests, which is an outcome that you wouldn't expect for a mental health program. But they were showing that at the same time that they implemented their program, Akron had developed a drug court. So the researcher felt like they were increasing their arrests because the drug court allowed the officers to get the person in crisis to better resources versus taking them to an involuntary confinement through the hospital where they'd be released in 48 to 72 hours. So although it sounds, it's a negative outcome per se, but the officers were viewing it as they were getting better long-term outcomes. So this is why we were saying that a lot of these programs, what we're seeing both for Durham and potentially the other cities, is really looking at each city, tailoring the approach to what works for your agency, what works for the resources that you have, what works for the culture of your city and your police agency and what you already have in play, and then developing a tailored approach. And the importance of evaluation is also to understand those outcomes and those effects on those programs. Because what we do know from research, especially when it comes to doing social interventions with policing, is that we've seen historically that when we've done interventions in policing on society without doing evaluations, is often we have these backfire effects that we don't know about. Like Scared Straight is one example of a program that was taken on, adopted across the country, and we didn't know that there was harmful backfire effects to children until 20 years later when we ran randomized controlled trials to show that actually we were increasing the recidivism rate among kids that were going through Scared Straight versus kids that we just left alone and did nothing. So those are just some things to keep in mind as we go through this process.
Thanks so much, Renee. So here we want to present a potential path forward. So I will present this screen, briefly go over it. Then Monica, if you think it's appropriate, I can take the screen down, or we could pivot to the use of force report. I just want to be mindful of the time. We have 21 minutes here. So these are the things that we think that can be done immediately as we're considering the other potential pilots. So the two potential pilots for the first point that we were discussing is expand and evaluate the existing DPD co-response strategy and explore whether the clinician could ultimately respond without law enforcement support. The second would be to pilot the mental health identification and documentation plan. And again, to Dr. Strom's point, I think it's important that those two things are complementary, and we could potentially do both in pretty rapid fashion. The other potential pilot would include systematically identifying which call natures could be diverted to a technological resource like P2C. That's the non-urgent call category that we were discussing. And in terms of trying to get a sense of community expectations, we could pilot a survey where callers would be asked about their willingness to accept an alternative response in the future. So they actually wouldn't get the response, but we would understand over time with enough data whether it's something that the community would be supportive of. And again, as Monica mentioned, we're working with all of the stakeholders in city government to make sure any of the pilots that we suggest are actually feasible and we can actually implement it. So Monica, I will defer to you as to whether I should take the screen down or if you'd like to share the use of force report, it's up to you.
So I'm going to look to council to understand the will of the council. Do you all want to stop to have conversation on this? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
I think we should do this, Monica, because you've kind of led us to this point. Then we can talk about the use of force report, and that may make some additional comments, relative to that. But since you've got us here and you're presenting us with these choices, and again, I'm mindful of time.
Sounds great. So we will invite any comments now. Councilmember Middleton or Mayor?
I'll yield.
Okay. Mayor Schul? No. Mayor said no. You have the floor, Councilmember Middleton.
Thank you, Madam Monica. Just real quickly, I know Dr. Agard alluded to it when we first had the potential path forward, these bullets up, but he did say reduce negative public police contact and pair the appropriate. So I just want to make sure that's reflective of it. Because if you look at one of the potential pilots, if it's expand and evaluate existing DPD co-response strategy, then a co-response strategy implies that an officer still may be there with a professional or clinician with them. So I think it's important that we say it's reducing negative public police contact if we're going to indeed be looking at a co-response strategy. So one of the for linguistic integrity, and I think that Gary got already alluded to that verbally, but since it's before us again graphically, I just wanted to point that out, the importance of codifying that.
Words definitely matter, so thank you for that. Mayor Schul and then Councilmember Freeland, we'll pick you up once Mayor Schul is done. Is that good?
Thank you, Monica. A couple of observations. In terms of which of these pilots to do, I would say all of them. They all look very good. They all look important. And I know that you all will figure out you'll figure out the logistics, but from what I understood I see he doesn't want to be Dr. Agard. Okay, cool. From what Brian was saying, that these are things that can be done while we're working on, we're still pushing ahead on these other fronts. So that's my vote. A couple of other things. One is I just want to say, Shannon, I appreciated the memo about the inventorying of resources. I just want to say that I know that the Criminal Justice Resource Center, and in particular the Criminal Justice Advisory Committee, which are county entities, are already doing a lot of inventorying for this, in preparation for working with our Community Wellness and Safety Task Force and with this process for our 911 calls. So I know that there's already some inventorying being done. They've had meetings where they've asked some of the providers of these services to present so that they can be ready to work with us. And so, Monica, I hope I think an early contact needs to be with them in terms of the inventory. They're doing a lot of work, and they really want to show us what is already available in the county, which is super important. Just what at the very beginning we were talking about cahoots being embedded in a bigger system of mental health supports and a clinic. I just that we got to make that happen. Just having the police response or the non-police response or whatever the first response is, without everything to back it up, is going to be really important. And this leads me again to, I feel really important that we need to have, Charlie put in the, partner with Lincoln Community Health. Yeah, exactly. And I think about, the county and they have so many of the resources that we need. So somehow we've really got to work them into this process. And I'm wondering if one thing might not be, Monica, that they, a shorter, version of this presentation for them. Because I really think if they understood what we were doing, they would be, full partners. Maybe we could do it at Joint City County at some point, but just, I hope you'll think about that. And then the other thing I want to say is that one of the advantages of not being first to some of these programs is that we can be the best. We can take what we see from these. We can, strive to do create the absolute best system that anybody has. And I hope that's what we'll do. And so I'm thinking that, yeah, and I just, this data is such a rich trove from which to work. And so I'm really appreciative of it. I'm really appreciative of the cooperation of 911 and police department and fire and everybody. It's so clear that this is a group effort across the city. And so just want to express my gratitude for that. Yeah, those are my comments.
Thank you. Councilmember Freelon.
Thank you, Monica. And Steve, I'm just going to bounce right off some of the stuff you said. A lot of where my head's been at has been thinking about city-county collaboration. Charlie, you took the words right out of my brain around Lincoln Community Health collaboration. I had the exact same thought when I was thinking about kind of the deep dive on how Cahoots works, when Renee kind of really went into the weeds about that and talked about the clinic part of that program. And I think that would be really amazing. I wanted to mention just at the top, because we just looked at the slide on the family liaison piece that they do in the UK. I really like that. And, Steve said all of it. I'm a fan of a lot of what was presented today too, but just to put a point into that one, especially for grieving families that are impacted by violence, I agree with what Renee said about that. I don't know how I feel about a police officer kind of catering to the grieving needs of a family that has been harmed by the police department. I don't think that's a great idea, and it sounds like that's what they're doing in the UK. But the idea of having someone help care for that family that's been harmed by violence in general, not by the police department, I do think is a good idea. And I think that person could be a community member, who holds space for healing, and also the logistics, like you said, the media, the mental trauma. I think that could be a really important resource and something that I've heard from a lot of folks, especially dealing with gun violence in Durham, and they don't have the mental health resources to cope with that really intense trauma. So that family liaison piece I thought was really interesting. So two other really quick notes. Some of what I've been hearing from community and folks that I'm accountable to is kind of a bigger picture thing around public safety and the significant investment that we make in policing and the $70 million we spend a year on policing and public safety. And when I saw the slide very early on about how 50% of the calls are concentrated on 5% of the block, that concentration of resources on those 5% of the streets has me thinking back to the Cahoots model about creating, either through Lincoln or another partner, some kind of, like a transformative justice hub or something like the Cahoots clinic in the community that is preventative as opposed to reactive. which I think has a has a longer impact on calls for service. I know this is about calls, but one of the things that I talked about, Chief Davis talked with Chief Davis at length about is like by the time you're making a lot of these calls, you know, the harm has kind of been done. So what can we do to prevent, but before the calls are made, the violence or harm that's being caused in the community? And you know, I'm just imagining, you know, Lincoln Health or maybe a new thing like a Polly Murray Healing Center kind of thing that also requires a massive shift in priority resources and strategy around taking some of the massive investment that we're making in public safety, reacting to crime, and reallocating some of that towards prevention, which could also have an impact on calls for service, and would allow our police department, I think, to downsize to really focus, which I think is something that, you know, you mentioned at the beginning, police departments have grown and are doing a lot of things that aren't really in their purview. And if we can really think about policing, about focusing on a very specific subset of things, you know, violent crimes. We had a situation a couple weeks ago where someone found a bomb in their house, you know, like bomb squad. We don't want community members showing up to disarm bombs. You want trained police officers to do that work. But I do think that there are other folks and other systems that would be better at preventing or reducing crime and enhancing public safety, and to have that be reflected in our budget. And just, yeah, I think that this is a good first start. But the model that was most interesting and transformative to me, I guess, was the Cahoots model, with all that it entailed, including the clinic, and kind of scaling that. And I know that's going to require some kind of city county something bigger than we're capable of doing ourselves. So while we take these initial steps to optimize efficiency, and I do want to keep that kind of big picture thing in mind.
Thank you, Councilmember Freelon. Councilmember Reese, your hand is raised.
Thank you, Monica. I appreciate that. Let me, I'm going to lower my hand. Awesome. I'm still learning after many months of this. First, I want to thank our staff, Monica, especially you and the folks on your team. I want to thank our friends and collaborators at RTI for bringing us not only the data, I guess it was sometime last month maybe, but also this very rich examination of the options that are being used in the real world in communities across the country, as well as some interesting ideas about what we might do here in Durham as a to kind of start looking at this issue. I will admit to being a little bit disappointed at the kind of the modest suggestions that are on the potential path forward slide, but I understand why we have to walk before we run. Totally understand that. I think there is a great desire in our community for us to already be running in this area, and so if I have anything to add to what the mayor and what Pierce said, it's that there is a strong desire in our community to see us do a lot more in this work. I think the ideas that are on that slide seem good to me. Let's try them. But I do think we need to be moving, and I hope that when our friends at RTI put things in their presentation that maybe tried to dispel some of the myths around the Cahoots program and programs like that around the country, that it was done to give us a more realistic sense of what's possible and not to, I don't know, dissuade us from trying that. I think that's right, and I hope that's right. But I think that ultimately, I think that's something that we're going to have to do in Durham. And I appreciate Pierce talking about the transformational possibility of that kind of work. I also want to say that as opposed to starting something new, I think one thing that I really appreciate the presentation bringing to the front, which I wasn't 100% locked in on, is that they didn't just start Cahoots some time ago from nothing, and it became successful. It springs out of an organization in their city that has deep community trust, that has a deep history and a legacy that folks can rely on. That's the problem I see with trying to do something new, is that it won't have that. But folks understand and trust the Lincoln Community Health Center. It's as many community health centers is woefully underfunded, and I think that in a partnership between the city and the county to field this kind of community response unit around some of these mental health issues and other types of quality of life issues, that we could help out with that. So I'm very optimistic about the possibility of that, and whatever portion of these things moves us towards something like that, I support. There's two other things I wanted to mention, and then I'll let other folks speak. First of all, one thing I don't see in the options or really even being contemplated, although it was mentioned briefly in the presentation, is work along the lines that's happening in Berkeley, California, around creating a separate traffic enforcement unit, potentially, as I think they're going to put it in their department, their city Department of Transportation, to manage traffic infractions, broken down cars, et cetera. One of the things I thought was most instructive about the data we saw at the last meeting that we had with the RTI was how many police calls revolve around traffic related issues, and how very, very few of them resort in arrest or use of force. And so I think that's another area that is open for investigation. I appreciate, as the potential path forward slide indicates, there may be some statutory limitations about what sworn law enforcement officers are required to respond to versus what we could ask a different unarmed department within the city to manage. But I still think that that's something very, very helpful to think about and to explore. And I just wanted to pick up on something that Steve mentioned about alarm calls. I think what Brian alluded to, without putting too fine a point on it, and I understand why, but I will put a very fine point on it, is that these private companies are selling our police response as a product, and they don't pay for that. The residents are paying for it through their taxes, but the response is being sold to their own police response is being sold to them by these private entities. How we respond to that reality is a big challenge, and I think bears further conversation. I think the data are pretty amazing, as Steve said, about what those calls actually represent in terms of risk versus the investment that we as a city make in providing police response to them. But I also understand that we have an alarm system in our house. When it goes off and we're not home, that's a real problem. And so people who have alarms expect to get some kind of response. My question would be, does it have to be a municipal response, or could it be a private security response because it is a private service they're selling? That involves lots of other problems that I'm not suggesting we go down that road. And regardless, I don't know how we would. Anyway, it's a complicated issue, but I think it's something we should definitely talk about, because as the mayor said, it's pretty amazing when you look at those numbers. And it would be also interesting to know how many of those were repeat false alarms, which we try to disincentivize through fines, but it never seems to work because the rules are so forgiving on those. But I've had to pay some of those fines too, so it's fine. I think, was there anything else I wanted to say about it? That's probably enough for now, and obviously we'll jump back in as we go along. Thanks, Monica, and everybody else.
We're nearing time, but I did want to point out to Councilmember Reese's point, those items on the path forward slide were a starting point, and we do have to walk before we run, but we can jog. And the information that you all have been giving us, I've been taking notes. I know my teammates been taking notes. We're going to go back to the lab, look at what the constraints might be, but where there's opportunities and we clearly see that there's alignment for maybe a more robust pilot, we will bring that back to you and those pilot implementation plans for consideration at a work session. So we can walk, we can jog, but yeah, we'll that was just a starting point. So I see Councilmember Freeman and then Mayor Pro Tem Johnson. I guess even before we go to Councilmember Freeman, to be respectful of the agenda times, Bertha, Mayor Schul, I realize we are at 11:30. Is it okay if we get Freeman, Johnson, and maybe a very high level summary of use of force?
Yes, exactly. What I was going to say, I know that that neither Councilmember Freeman nor Mayor Pro Tem Johnson had a chance to make some comments on this, and I do think we want to hear a high-level summary of the use of force. So why don't we aim for being through with this by 11:45 at the latest, Monica?
Perfect, got it. Councilmember Freeman?
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation, and I do want to thank Brian or Dr. I don't want to mess his last name up, which is why I just called him Brian, Dr. Brian. But I really appreciate the comments from my colleagues as usual. I just want to add, I guess, like another point in that conversation and acknowledging that I had hoped for a lot more technology focused feedback, and just acknowledging that 911 is the common number that everyone knows, but like Durham One Call or the non-emergency number, or even the number for Alliance Behavioral Health is not as common. And so finding ways to kind of link that call response was the side that I thought this conversation would probably lean more into. And I know that the first, collecting the data from the 911 call center is important, but I do hope that there's some chance or some opportunity to really wrap into the other phone numbers, which are 560-1200 for Durham One Call and 560-4600 for the non-emergency. And then I would also add 651-8401, and acknowledging that these numbers aren't as easy to say 911. And so just acknowledging that there could be a lot of foreground in this conversation that could actually alleviate some of that kind of call for service to Durham Police Department if those numbers were linked in some way. And so I know previously in our work session, I talked about finding a way to really dig in deep in this COVID response around housing. And I was all the way acknowledging how domestic violence has also been in the background of my mind, an issue in this kind of pandemic, and acknowledging that if there is a way to use the resources that we received as a city to be more proactive in addressing some of those disconnects in technology, whether it's software that talks to each other, acknowledging that the county sheriffs and the DPD might have a system in place, but does Alliance Behavioral Health, does Lincoln Community Health Center, does the Durham One Call staff have a way to reach one another or to redirect to one another where it doesn't get dropped if it is, in a sense, non-emergency emergency. And so acknowledging that when an emergency occurs, it's an emergency for me when I make that call. I just want to make sure that I'm reaching someone. And so often it is that 911 that's the response. I think there's a chance to conflate intentionally parts of this conversation, but I am concerned about how we conflate. And so I appreciate Councilmember Freeland's comments in tandem with Councilmember Middleton's, acknowledging that there is opportunity here if we go about it in a very good governance way, acknowledging that this is data that can often be considered slighted, as in who's reporting, who's making those calls, because often the people who have the alarms and those alarms going off are not always race neutral. And so I know that aspect of this conversation has not entered yet, but I do expect for there to be a more race-centered conversation around what race equity looks like in it. And I am looking forward to our very anticipated Racial Equity Commission and our Community Health and Safety Task Force being able to use this data to make some good concrete suggestions about how to move forward so that it's not just off the cuff. And so I'm mindful that this is a very large regional approach to the conversation. And so I appreciate the chance to see what other cities and towns are doing and how it aligns. And so I'm looking forward to also hearing from our chief on recommendations this cycle and next cycle. Just in anticipation that I know that she's been very outspoken about, being a very focused on, reforming the community police or reforming the police department in a way that supports what the community's been requesting. And so those are most of my comments, and I'm thinking that's about it right now.
Those are very helpful. Mayor Pro Tem Johnson.
Thank you. Super briefly, because I know we're out of time, in the interest of jogging, the things I would be most excited about coming back to us at a work session would be the diversion at the call center, 911 call center idea, which I thought was really interesting and something that I hadn't heard about or thought of, and seemed like a great idea. An independent mental health and quality of life response pilot that does not include a co-responder model. I think that having police officers on call to come to the site of one of those calls, if necessary, in the roughly 5%, I think it was, of calls where there was a need for an arrest, would be important. But having the officer go with the clinician to the call is concerning to me. I think that it dilutes the impact of having the unarmed response and the clinician first response, to have an officer there with the clinician. But having an officer as backup, I think, is of course a good idea, and that our clinicians would likely feel more comfortable knowing that they had someone who was there to back them up, that they could call for a quick response. And finally, I really think the traffic response options are a potential site for a lot of diversion, particularly with the things like going to a site of an accident and writing a report, or looking at an abandoned car, those kinds of things. And I want to think a little bit more about alarms. I had the same initial thought that Charlie had, was like, oh, could this be private security? But then I was like, well, then are we like outsourcing this to like paid arms? Like, does the private sector actually function worse than the public sector in this case? Because now you're talking about arming people who don't actually have any lines of authority to the public or to government. So that's a concern. But at the same time, I am concerned that our officers are spending a ton of time responding to alarms for seemingly no issue. My house has an alarm that doesn't call the police. But if it did, I would definitely, we need to think some more about the public versus the private sector in that kind of context. But definitely interested in bringing that back and thinking about it more, because it's that's a lot of wasted effort, and it seems like a big hole, but doesn't necessarily get at what I feel is the most important goal in this conversation, which was that first goal on your chart: reducing police interactions with the public and better aligning our response to the public need. So that's all. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all the work that y'all have done on this. And I think we are in a really good position to keep moving this work forward. And I'm really excited to continue having the conversation at our work session. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments before we switch to use of force data? Councilmember Middleton.
Just very quickly, I want to associate myself with the Mayor Pro Tem's comments, particularly about the robustness of our response protocols. If we decouple the responding clinician from the officer, but retain the ability of that clinician to call for backup, that means we've got to have sufficient staffing for them to be able to call for the backup. So I think we just need to keep that in mind moving forward. Thanks. Looking forward to the use of force presentation.
Great. So we will pivot to there. I will just quickly say that there's probably going to be some state laws that are going to come into contact when it's related to if someone has to be on scene with the mental health clinician, but we're going to do our due diligence. Clearly, we need to add a legal resource to this group as well. So I'll look to City Manager Page. I don't know what's going to be the most appropriate, but we're going to have someone who has a really good sense of the legal landscape. But with that, I will ask Brian, do you want me to pull up the memo and you can speak from there? What's,
Sure. Yeah, if you don't mind. And I think the last table within that report will be most relevant to this discussion. I know we only have a few minutes, but I did just want to provide an overview. This provides the frequencies of different types of use of force. So not just the use of force overall, but the which specific types, and that's the last table there. So can you scroll to the very last page, Monica? There we go. So this is from this past October of 2020, 3 years back. So this is 3 years of data, just under 1 million calls. And these are the counts of the use of force by each use of force type. So firearm was deployed twice, canine twice, taser 21 times. So when you look at the total number of calls that had use of force applied, and I will just note that there are more use of force. It's not a one-to-one relationship with the call, so there can be use of force applied within one call type. Just wanted to note that. And then the others, so like an aerosol weapon would be something like OC spray. So the main takeaway here is that in the past 3 years, these are the numbers and the types. If you're interested in how these use of force came to be, you can see the call, how it was related. So the call nature and then the analysis nature group, those 18 that we coded up into. So for mental health, you can see, and we can go back and re-crosstab on that. But for all of the calls that are related to mental health, you can see which individual counts resulted in a use of force. And if you want to do a crosstab of a crosstab to see what type of use of force for what type of calls, that's something we can go back into the data and provide if needed. There is an accompanying file that DPD provided for us that will allow us to do initial analyses. So if there are certain things that you're interested in seeing, please just let us know.
Brian, can I ask the soft hands with injury? Does that mean there's a category of soft hands that did not, is with injury means it resulted in some injury, or what does it mean?
I'll defer to DPD on that. So there is some information on the general order included. I don't know it well enough to speak authoritatively to it though.
Okay, let's don't answer it today, but it'd be interesting to know that. I guess what I'm interested in then is there a larger category of soft hands that did not result in injury? You know, I'm unclear about that. So if you could just get us that at some point, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
sorry, I'm facilitating and taking notes, but I got that down as a takeaway. So that concludes what we have and what we have time for. We will be back. We're going to get this team together, go through what information you've provided, come up with some pilot action plans, and be back before you in front of you at a work session. Mayor, I did take down your suggestion of potentially going to the county and sharing a similar presentation. So I'll be in conversations with my leadership on what's the most appropriate next step.
And we give you a huge shout out, Monica, you and your team, and the folks from RTI. Much gratitude. This is just such high quality work, and we're really grateful. Thank you, Madam Manager.
I would just like to say thank you to this team. I won't add a lot of words, but I did want to make one point that wasn't spoken about very much here today, but it's certainly part of this work. And that is certainly the standing up of the Community Safety and Wellness Task Force, the resources that are going to be provided to that task force, and just how much community engagement and collaboration with some of the county matters, since that is a county-wide task force that's going to help inform and advance this work from the very big picture. So I just want to make sure that in this meeting that the council understands our connection to the work we're doing here inside with the standing up of that Community Safety and Wellness Task Force, the value that they're going to bring.
Madam Manager, I wonder if it would be useful for you to mention the Fuse Fellow now. I'm not sure that all of our colleagues are aware of that in support of that work.
Yes, we do have a Fuse Fellow that will be joining us and assigned directly to work with the Community Safety and Wellness Task Force at the beginning of May. That will be a full-time resource that the city does not have to pay for. That Fuse Corp, which is a national nonprofit, thanks to some connectivity that some of the council members, Mayor Pro Tem had, we were part of a grant and we're receiving fellowship resources, seasoned fellows that have 10 to 15 years of experience and will be recruited directly from our community to work in these spaces, but can certainly be dedicated to one task or to two tasks or initiatives that we have, so that we can really get a lot of return from that resource. We will have someone assigned to that task force for 12 months.
Thank you. And it was great. Mayor Pro Tem made the connection, and of course, our city manager jumped on it. And we have 3 Fuse Fellows coming. I'm very, very excited. All right. I'm going to now ask if Bertha Johnson could guide us. We are actually doing pretty well, maybe a little behind, but can you give us some guidance, Bertha?
Thank you, Mayor. We were scheduled to take a 15-minute break. I know that last few hours has been very intense. And we have a major item next, our budget development guidelines. We are sending those to you now. To the mayor's point about trying to share a screen and have a discussion at the same time being somewhat challenging. So we're going to email those to you so you can have those and we can take down the screen after each section and have a discussion. So I leave it to you all. Is 15 minutes sufficient? Do you want to come back at 12? You know, how much time do you need to prepare for the next discussion?
I'll ask my colleagues. I guess my thought would be we could come back at 12, which is 13 minutes from now. That would give everybody a chance to go get their peanut butter sandwich. And then we would be well fed and rested for a good hour of discussion on the budget guidelines. And then we'll all just have to promise to keep our closing remarks relatively brief. Does that sound good to you, Bertha?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Everybody good? Okay. So we'll see everyone at 12 o'clock. Thank you so much.
This is just a reminder to council and staff that if you have your video or audio on, that we are still on YouTube.
Christina, can you hear me?
I can.
So thank you for the chart on the historical property tax. Great work. I was just looking at it, and because of the revals, our total tax rate and our general fund rate, and a lot of them are down between FY17 and FY21. The total tax rate is down.
That's correct.
I want to is there a way to help people understand? We've had a very low percentage of increase, but we have had an increase. And with this, it's a little bit hard to help people understand that maybe.
Hey, Steve.
Hey, Charlie.
Are you talking about during reval years wanting to know, and I haven't seen the chart, I apologize, but
it
having
just
to know
came. Yeah.
the increase from the revenue neutral rate?
Well, look at the chart that that John Alorja sent us, the second.
I didn't look
attachment.
at the second attachment. Right. Okay.
Yeah. So the bottom of the second attachment, if you look over in the next to last column on the right, like FY17, the tax rate was 56.07. Now the tax rate is 53.17. But we also know we had some, so the rate is down, but we've had some tax increases. So I was just trying to ask Christina if there was a way to, put some context on that. I was thinking, what percentage of tax increases have we had in the last few years? That was really what I was trying to think about, Christina.
Steve, are you thinking something like the tax burden on the median valued home or something like that?
Well, not so much that, because that would really have more to do with valuation than our tax increases.
Well, but that's what the reval does, right? Like the tax rate has gone down. People are paying a lower rate. They're paying more money because their value's gone up.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's right. I'm trying to wrap my mind around this a little and, figure out a way to usefully have the discussion to understand, what our rate has really done.
Steve, how I think about it is 3 times in the last 5 years, we have changed our tax rate to generate more property tax revenue. Those are the choices that we make. Out of the 5 budgets, we've done that 3 times. And we've done it at a pretty consistent level, to be honest with you. I was actually looking at that last night. It's pretty amazing how narrow the range is. We either do no increase or we do, on average around about 1.71 cents increase. We don't go in between ever, which I think is fascinating. But I think Jillian's right. The reval makes it harder to have that kind of conversation I think you want to have. But I think the way I think about it is that over the last 5 years, 3 times we have used an increase in the tax rate to generate more property tax revenue to meet critical needs. The other 2 years, for various reasons, we've decided we didn't want to do that. The other thing to remember is that in every year, except the reval years, we get additional property tax revenue without increasing the tax rate because the size of the base increases. We didn't get that in the 2 reval years, which I think is one of the reasons why we increased it that year. The real outlier, if you think about it in that way, is fiscal year 18, where we increased the tax rate and we got that increase in the base. That was a good year for maybe not so good for the taxpayers, but good for us.
Christina, you've heard the comments of my brilliant colleagues. What would you have to say about them?
I think I agree as well too. I think the reval, having that revenue neutral rate is kind of it does make it more difficult because that's the idea that would not be the idea that would not be raising taxes, and then anything above revenue neutral is a tax increase. But I do agree with Councilmember Reese's point that we do there is natural growth that happens even if we don't raise taxes that, you know, we use.
All right, thank you. Thank you, colleagues.
I think about this tax rate a lot, probably too much.
Well,
I spent a lot of time.
yeah, I do think, you know, to Jillian's point, the growth in our taxes, and Charlie, you've made that, I've heard you make this point many times. The growth in our taxes is because your house is more valuable, not because we have a higher tax rate. And so it's important.
I'll tell you what's interesting is that I hear more and more community members using the technically correct language these days. They don't, not very often, still some, but very few people now say, why do you keep raising my taxes?
Mm-hmm.
It's our taxes are going up and you're doing nothing to stop it. That is
right.
disheartening, but technically accurate. Which
right.
Also, you know, I mean, you know, in reval years, we lower the tax rate to the revenue neutral rate. So it's not that we're doing nothing. We don't have to do that. So we could just keep it the same. We just have to report out how much of a tax increase that is. But we do it that way. So we're not doing nothing. But aside from that, there's very little we have the tools to do. But anyway, so I think that's great. I think more people are understanding. I think the reason that is that we've had 2 revals in a 3-year period, which is something we've never done in Durham ever. 16 and 19 were really big educational moments, I think, for a ton of homeowners where they realized, and you know, a lot of us had to do that education in 2019. You know, a lot of us were on, you know, in community meetings and in social media explaining to folks, no, we don't do the reval to increase revenues. That is not what happens. If we want to increase your taxes, we got to tell you. So anyway, good times.
It does redistribute the burden in interesting ways, though, depending on what happens.
Yep, absolutely.
And that redistribution has been a serious problem.
Yep.
In recent years, and it'll be interesting to see if it continues to be.
Especially without the ability to cap the amount that poor folks pay in property taxes.
Right.
That really is troublesome, obviously, and the ability and the inability to say, for example, charge a surtax on homes over $1 million, or so that I include myself over $500,000. Just not to, I don't want to carve myself out. My headphones are running out of power. That's really disconcerting. All right, well, I'll just have to unplug.
Hey, can y'all hear me right now?
Yes, you sound fine.
Awesome. Thank you. By the way, I love the decision to make the tax increase for the affordable housing bond part of the dedicated housing fund tax allocation rather than break it out separately. I think that's really smart.
Colleagues, it is now 12 o'clock, and maybe some of you have been fortunate enough to hear a scintillating conversation between myself and several other people, my brilliant colleagues, about a theoretical discussion of taxes. But we are back now for real business, and I'm going to turn it over to our budget director, Bertha Johnson.
Good afternoon, Bertha Johnson, Director of Budget Management Services. First, I want to thank Monica and her leadership team for the 911 Call for Services project, and also our RTI partners, as you all have done as well. So I really appreciate all the hard work. It takes a significant amount of her time to work on this project, and so I'm very grateful for her leadership. So it's time for the budget development guidelines. We have sent them to you all. We're going to pull them up on the screen. And what I thought, Mayor, is that we would go through the sections and then take down the presentation. You have a hard copy or email copy for reference as we discuss those. And then I would invite interim city manager, Wanda Page, to jump in at any point that she needs to, as well as provide any clarification around decisions we made in the guidelines. So first, I want to point out what we've done here. We have those items in black font that we don't believe need further discussion at this time. Obviously, City Council can disagree with that and pull any of those items for discussion. For the sake of time, we have those items in red that we believe that still need discussion, whether that discussion happens today or at a later date. The plan is to bring forward the budget development guidelines to the March 18th work session, which will be the April 5th City Council meeting for final adoption. So there is some time between today and then to have further discussion and to think about the guidelines. So that is the plan moving forward. I'm not going to start at the first part of the document. I'm really going to skip down to revenues. And I want to point out here before we talk about revenues, what we've said all along in the last few days is, the only way we can significantly make additional additions to the general fund is through property tax and sales tax. So the only revenue source, again, we all know that we actually control is property tax. And so as we think about the expenditure side, we have to keep in mind how we balance the revenue side. I want to point out the first bullet here. I'll start there. Where we have the tax rate for the general fund will remain at 30.83 cents. That's obviously in red because that's the balancing factor of the general fund, or could be the balancing factor of the general fund. And so that will come at a later time. The second item, the tax rate for the debt service fund will remain at a current 11 cents. There was some discussion about adding a penny here to increase capacity for our CIP in FY22. So that item is still in red, as I do not deem that as being resolved, but I'm happy to change that if we need to do so at this time. So just a reminder, the entire property tax rate of 53.17 cents is broken out in the general fund and the solid waste fund, as you see here, dedicated housing fund, transit fund. So none of the others are in red because we do not believe we've heard that we need to make a change to those allocations at this point. And then we have, I'll move down to the water and sewer rate increases. We have gotten information from our water management department that they do not anticipate proposing a rate increase more than 3.6% for the tier 3 customer. And there's a note there about the breakdown of that increase. You will have a presentation from water management April or May, where they will provide you the details of what's included in that rate increase, and you will have an opportunity to actually approve that increase at that time. We always include an up to number in the budget development guidelines. Same as the stormwater rate, we have heard back from Public Works about this rate increase, and they're proposing that the rate increase not exceed 0.51 cents per month. And again, you will have an opportunity to hear from that department directly about that proposed rate increase. So those are the items on the revenue side. And so I will ask Christina to take down the presentation and entertain any questions about the revenue side of the budget development guidelines.
Councilmember Reese.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wanted to go first on this because I wanted to make an apology to my colleagues. As you may have noticed, when we had the conversation about increasing the tax rate for the affordable housing bond in the upcoming fiscal year, I became somewhat decompensated by the idea that we would do that when we didn't need to. I don't think any of you were spared the result of that, the decompensation, but after the meeting, a dear friend and mentor said to me, Charlie, just wait and see what Bertha and Wanda come up with. There are lots of ways to skin this apple. Peel the apple. Anyway, yeah. And so, Steve, I'm grateful to you for that advice because I decided to put a pin in my emotional response and wait until we saw a draft of the guidelines. Sure enough, they look awesome. We still have some open questions about what kind of departmental requests we're going to see, about what we want to do with the portion of the tax rate dedicated to the debt service fund. I continue to think that we can enhance that to give us some short-term capacity to enhance the CIP a bit in advance of the work we're trying to do on a bond, whatever we want to call it. And I still think that we still need to figure out how to pay for the salary portion, the pay portions of the plan that we've seen. And I really appreciate staff's inclusion of the breakout between recurring and non-recurring costs. I think it was very helpful to me. But mostly, I just wanted to say I appreciate everyone else not losing their stuff the way I did. And want you to know that this is why there are 7 of us and not 1 of us, among many reasons. The city is much better served by not having me make all the decisions. And I know you all feel the same way. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember Reese. Other comments? Councilmember Middleton.
Thank you, Stephen. I think the guidelines this far look good as well. Charlie, I didn't think you were being emotional. I thought you were passionately, ably arguing your point. Emotional would be not being able to pivot when you got new information. So you're good. So I appreciate you. I think the tax rate for the debt service fund, it's in red, remaining at 11 cents. And from our previous conversation, I'm really looking towards, and I forgot who it was. It may have been you, Steve. We talked about how we did the penny for housing, then the 2 penny for housing, and then we ultimately, ratcheted up towards the bond. So I think I'm going to be more inclined to looking, perhaps building some capacity in that tax rate for the CIP with an eye towards the green infrastructure bond, with due respect to all the other, reasons I talked about, time to build up, make the case. But I look forward to the discussion, though. I don't want to be emotional because new information might come forward or a compelling argument to cause me to pivot. No problem with that. And I'm hoping that the tax rate for the general fund could remain at it. I'm cautious because we're talking about pay increases, which I think is absolutely necessary for our incredible staff and other departmental requests as well. But so far, as usual, this is the type of work product that has made Durham literally the envy of so many cities around the country. So again, Bertha, we're running out of superlatives. So y'all the bomb. Thanks. That's it.
Great. Other comments? Councilmember Freeman.
Thank you. I appreciate my colleagues' comments, and I'm noting that I'm probably the one that did get emotional in this year and last year, and I think that mainly around this context of how a green infrastructure bond would help with our guidelines in street maintenance and some of the other areas. I'm still hopeful, and I appreciate the way it's all been laid out as usual. And of course, I know that we're doing more than I was expecting, so I feel a little bit better, but thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. Agreed with my colleagues as usual. This looks great. I think having a little bit of the option to do the 1 cent in the debt service fund would be good, whether or not we choose to do it, but having it in the guidelines that's something that we're considering, I think would be great. And then was wondering if y'all had a sense of the departmental requests. I don't know what stage y'all are at in that evaluation, but what kind of additional money might be needed for those requests?
I will let John Allure talk about where we are on the process as he supervises analysts as they work through the budget request. And
council members, and I'll be brief. We're still analyzing it. Budgets just came in on Monday, complete budgets. We did get budget requests prior to that, but we're still looking at the full picture. So I apologize, but I don't have a complete answer for that as to a dollar amount.
No worries. Yeah, so I'm sure, as we continue to move through the process, that, general fund tax rate we'll figure out what we need to do with that. But if there is any, I think for me, raises, of course, and salary increases are the number one priority, but being able to put in some new programming, if we could make that happen, would be great. We're kind of in this double bind where we know that needs in the community are higher and capacity in the financial capacity in the community is lower, and that's just where we are with COVID. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments? This is the best document of the year. This is like poetry. Just of everything we do, this always seems like the most important 3 pages of paper. And it's always great. I think that Bertha, what you're hearing is some flexibility from council members around potentially general fund tax rate, especially for pay, but potentially for some other things, and around the green and equitable infrastructure in the debt service fund. So I think, is that enough, or would you like more specific guidance? I mean, sometimes you ask us to, say how much tax we'd be willing to go for. Do you want that at this point? Or we can certainly try to give you some guidance. Or would you prefer that to have the flexibility at this time?
So I guess going back to the debt service fund, I thought what I heard is that this council would be willing to consider up to an additional 1 cent. If that is the guidance, and that's what will show up in the guidelines when we bring them forward to be adopted. On the general fund side, we will be able to provide you more information about what we may need as we continue to analyze the budget request. And when we come to the work session on the 18th, we will have more information to share at that time, and then you can make that final decision.
I would say, I don't think we quite made that decision about the 1 cent, but I think we should discuss that.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I think there's still some discussion needs to happen. Councilmember Caballero.
Yeah, I appreciate what Bertha just shared. I'm, very keen on trying to keep the general fund rate where it is, but I also want to know, I know that there are certain programmatic elements that if we want them, we're gonna have to be flexible on that. So I look forward to that conversation later in March. And with the debt service fund, want to hear more from colleagues. I see the need, and also, again, worried about the impact on the community. So.
Thank you. I do want to remind us that we're still in the place with the green and equitable infrastructure, or sustainable and equitable infrastructure, I think is what the staff called it, that we're, shall we say, our staff is in a period of discernment. They are trying to figure out, or they're going to give us some guidance about what a potential bond might look like, which of course wouldn't mean, would be on an upcoming ballot for a future tax increase to fund, and then that's different from any changes that we would make this year. So just a reminder, I know you all know that. Other thoughts about the rate? I'll suggest one possible approach. We're putting in 1.38 cents for the dedicated housing fund. One option would be that we could say that some combination of general fund and debt service fund increase not to exceed 6.62 cents. That would give us a maximum increase of 2 cents. in total. That's one possible approach. Another approach would be to do an up to say to, and I'm wide open. Any thoughts that you have? Councilmember Freeman.
Thank you. I just wanted to just share from my standpoint specifically, I think without the departments kind of laying out what it is that they're moving forward with, it's hard. But I want to be clear that if it were race equity based, youth based, or in any way, shape, or form, harm reduction, I'd be willing to go as high as 5 cents in a tax year, but specifically acknowledging that the tax grant has to be in place and it has to kind of cover in a race equity solution format the folks who would actually be impacted directly in rental and housing. So I think that's all kinds of conflated for you, but gives you a little bit of where I'm at.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up, one of the things that we have not, there's nothing in here. If the county was to come up with a real workable long-term low-income homeowner tax relief, that would be a proposal they would bring to us. There's a lot of interest on our part and on the community's part in that, and that would cost something. The cost would be variable. It would depend on how, if we were to adopt such a program, what that would look like. But I do think that that's something to keep in mind as well. I see Councilmember Reese. I like the idea of capping the overall property tax increase to 2 cents. So that's one potential approach. Colleagues, your comments? We don't have to lock this down now. We can keep it more flexible, and that's really our choice. Councilmember Middleton.
Yeah, given the number of unsubstituted variables, I really just want to hear at this point, we've got some time from the departments and from staff on the issues they're still kind of vetting and working through. I understand the value in capping it from a optically, spiritually, kind of commitment wise to our residents. But I don't feel particularly compelled or constrained to have to do that today. I really want to hear some more drill down. Speaking for me, just one of 7 from the staff. I will say with respect to Deidreana, and I want to honor her work and her advocacy on the infrastructure and equity bond. And I want to go on record right now, Deidreana, saying that I think that bond should happen. And I support it. And my approach, recommending an incremental approach to it is very much tethered to it ultimately happening. And I see, the spirit of the conversation we had about increasing capacity in CIP was equity based. So if we do go up a penny on the debt service in CIP, I'm expecting that that's increasing capacity linked to the spirit of the conversation we had about equity and the green infrastructure, which is a real, I have some experience with not getting everything you want when you want it. But it's a step towards, a concrete step, I think, towards that with an eye towards the bond. So I don't think, I'm not saying you do. I think we shouldn't see that as a defeat if we don't do the bond this year. We might do it this year, but if we don't, I think that increasing of capacity in the CIP could be a real concrete step in the right direction. So I would see that increase as addressing equity issues, notwithstanding whether we do the bond this year or not, but we're still moving in the right direction. But as far as caps, I'd rather have some more conversation and hear from the staff, but that's just me. So for what that's worth. Thanks, Mayor. Steve.
Thank you. I think that there is another alternative, which is, and I'll proffer this to you, Bertha, that we remain flexible on the general fund and debt service rate, and we look to you for guidance with the with the affirmative hope that we will be able to keep the total property tax rate below 2 cents. But that we recognize that we need to hear more from you all about our needs. So let me propose that as a kind of middle ground and see if colleagues are, I'm hearing a strong desire to wait and see just what the needs are. But also, I know there's also a strong desire to try to hold this below 2 cents. And so maybe that would be a consensus approach. And I wonder, Bertha, if that would be an acceptable approach.
Yes, Mayor, that would be an acceptable approach. If it's okay with the other city council members, we will definitely leave these two flexible, but keep in mind that we want to stay below 2 cents. And if there's some sensational reason to do more, we will certainly make you aware of that prior to our work session.
So let me ask colleagues, is that an approach that you all would find acceptable? I'm seeing some thumbs. I'm seeing everybody's thumb. Okay, good. Thank you all. That was really helpful. Let me then turn it back to you, Bertha, and see what's next.
Okay, so next we're going to go to the expenditures, and Christina, will you bring that back up on the screen? I think the one that will probably bear the most discussion is the pay and benefit portion. The benefit portion, not so much, but the first bullet there, the pay adjustments would be considered for general employees up to 2%, police up to 4%, and fire up to 3.5%. That part was what you saw in scenario 2 presented by Human Resources yesterday. We have made some adjustments to the bonuses here in order to create some equity, as was implied by some of you as of interest. So what we have here is the following levels: $1,500 for employees earning less than $50,000, $1,250 for employees earning over $50,000, up to $90,000, and $1,000 for employees earning over $90,000. We did not change those limits, although I think we heard one council member mention something about the dollar amounts. The retirement, there's no change to that. Medical insurance, we already mentioned when we talked about the multi-year fund, that there was no increase for the upcoming year. Dental 7%, and then there's the local government retirement increases that are controlled by the retirement board. And so this section, I think the discussion we need to have really is on bullet 1.
Okay, thank you very much. Colleagues, you'll see the bullet 1 under the following pay and benefit components will be proposed. I like this bullet, but I'm interested in others' responses to it. Go ahead and speak up. I can't see everybody on the screen. So there we go.
I'm just gonna.
Go ahead, Piers.
I was just gonna say I like it as well. I think it took into account the conversation we had, and it definitely makes sense. So.
Thank you. Pierce, did you want to comment? Okay. Javier?
Yeah, thank you. I like it as well. Just for clarification purposes, the bonuses could get pulled from fund balance, correct? Because it's a one-time cost. I just want to make sure. I thought that's what we shared yesterday, but I just want to make sure that
is correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
Yeah. So I appreciate what you all did here. I want to thank my colleagues for thinking about the not going less than 1,000 and then still building in the equity. And thank you to staff for doing that work so quickly.
There's a question in the chat from Councilmember Reese. Bertha, do we know what the total cost comparison to the other scenarios? You all had worked out those 3 cost scenarios yesterday.
Yes, we don't know. The only change here would be the bonus amounts. And so we would need to calculate those amounts because the other amounts are the same as in scenario 2. So obviously when we raise the bonus maximum from 1,000 to 1,500, we'd have that difference there for those employees who would earn the $1,500 bonus, but we can get that back to you very quickly.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, let me just make sure that we have anybody else want to comment on this first bullet that Bertha has asked for feedback? Are we good with it? Want to show some thumbs? Okay, good. sounds like we're good.
I just want to reiterate that these are up to amounts. And so obviously we need to look at how we can fit this within the budget with all the other priorities. And so just for those watching, as well as, city council members, these are up to, because we have not analyzed all the budget requests at this point. We've already started getting some emails last night about this from some folks talking about implementation, and we need to make it clear that this has not been finalized. These are just guidelines that we will use to develop the budget.
It's all wishful thinking.
Well, more educated forecasting. So we hope to get there. So thank you. I'll have Christina pull them back up. I think the last part of this will go fairly quickly. The next few items you will see: the dedicated street resurfacing funding, the maintenance replacement project, the fleet replacement funding. Those items we discussed when we discussed the budget development guidelines. So I assume that everyone's okay with those. If not, this would be the time to let me know. The last item that we added here is funding for city council budget requests. We considered up to $600,370. We've added the 212 is one time, and the 387 or 388 is recurring. And I think, Christina, if you scroll down, we have a breakdown of those. Again, to the mayor's point, one-time items can be paid for out of fund balance. The recurring ones, we would have to find a recurring funding source for those. If it was to impact the tax rate, which we're not necessarily saying it will at this point, you see what that number is on the chart. It was 0.16, but when we backed out the one time, that comes down to 0.11. So we will, if there are no questions, we'll take that down and just have discussions on this side.
I have a quick question about that. Specifically the We Are the Ones request, I was thinking was for an ongoing program and not just for a one-time thing, but maybe Pierce can clarify. I had thought that it was going to be a multi-year commitment.
Well, in the proposal, there was a 2-year commitment. But I guess we were talking yesterday about leading with the ambassador program, and there's still some things to sort out from what the county and is willing to commit. So I know Steve and I are going to circle back and check in with the county next week, and I can. I've already, during the meeting, I just shot a quick email out to the We Are the Ones partners. So I'll put that question on the list for them and follow back up with you.
Steve?
Sorry, Mark Anthony. Yeah.
Thanks. Absolutely. And my question is kind of a riff off of Jillian's. I thought that We Are the Ones was recurring, and El Centro was one time funding. I didn't realize it was not that it affects my support of it. I didn't realize it was in effect becoming a line item for the city. So I thought that it was flipped, and We Are the Ones. So I appreciate the clarification. So.
To Councilman Freelon's comments, I don't think we resolved where we're going with We Are the Ones at this point until those discussions are had. And so hopefully the next time you see this document, we will be clear about what it is we are recommending, and we'll know more about the other commitments.
If I might, my follow-up question, Bertha, where in our budget will the $930,000 for the violence interruption, the Bull City United expansion, where would that be housed, if you will, or reflected?
I will turn that over to interim manager Wanda Page. I know they're working on that agreement, and I know what the one-time source is this year, but I'm not sure about what we plan for future years.
Pardon me for being on mute. Certainly, our plan is that is a continual program that we support. And when we bring the item for approval to the council in the next few weeks, it will include, a continual agreement with the county to continue that program, which means we will have to build that into our base budget. That's what it means.
Finally, colleagues, and I know that we've had some talk about our travel allowances. I have heard some rumblings from colleagues around the country and colleagues at NLC and other organizations that they might be trying in 2020, what is this, 2021, 2022, to resume some in-person meetings, of course, depending upon science and trending. And I'm just wondering if we need to keep that. And I know we have different responsibilities, different organizations around the country, and if we might want to consider not hobbling ourselves or building in some limitations in the event that those things do happen, in order for us to fulfill our responsibilities. Understand totally the importance of us leading in terms of budgetary restraint during this time of COVID. But if we're going forward with the raises, we're going forward with some other things. Just want to put that out there that we might want to keep in mind that if there's some opening up around the country in the coming months and next year, to think about positioning ourselves to be able to do our work and meet all of our responsibilities that may have us on the road. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, I'll just comment on that briefly, which that may happen. The cuts we made in that were in response to the manager's request for every department to turn in a budget with a 3% decrease. And so I guess, let's see, I'm just refreshing my memory. Myself and the clerk worked on our budget and had that in as the decrease with, we informed council and we all agreed with a head nod. So if we were to restore that, we would just need to find some other decreases in our budget, which we could certainly do.
Sure.
So I believe that I could certainly, between myself and the clerk, I think we could dig up that email and get it around to colleagues. And, some people could look at other categories.
Mr. Mayor, I would just like to say that, it's been a long time in the organizations since we actually asked for the contingency cuts. The contingency cuts are for us to really, really plan as we're preparing the budget. All of those cuts that are submitted are not accepted by the budget staff and city management. It just gives us flexibility to try and really, really refine the budget in a way that, best reflects our priorities, but giving departments an opportunity to really, really look deeply into their budgets. And all budgets are not the same. All departments' budget sizes are not the same. So we realize that. And, that's why we have conversations with with folks in the departments that prepare the budgets and the cuts, and just want you to have that in mind as well, as we proceed through the process.
Thank you, Madam Manager. All right, Bertha, how are we doing?
We are doing great. I think unless there are other questions on the budget development guidelines, just a reminder again. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a question.
Yeah, I just was wondering with the council items, if the county comes back willing to co-fund the immigrant refugee coordinator position, because that's where we left it yesterday, is if they were willing to share that cost. There was at least I thought there was interest on council to continue that conversation.
We can certainly have that conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. After the maybe we get to travel conversation, I feel like a pessimist bringing this up, but I also wanted to have us think a little bit about refreshing our COVID relief fund out of one-time money next year. Depending on what, I don't know the status of what is remaining in the current fund, but I think that the impacts of the pandemic are certainly going to continue into the next year, and so having some additional funding for COVID relief that could be out of a one-time pot is something I'd like to propose.
I'll just say that even a pessimist has to expect something significant out of Washington for COVID relief. So it's my fervent hope that will be our COVID relief fund. But I'm no staff heard you, and we'll give that every consideration. And of course, we'll find out about Washington soon, I think.
That's great. Yeah, and I hope you're right. That'd be fabulous.
I'm not always right. You knew that. Councilmember Freeman.
Thank you. I appreciate Mayor Pro Tem Johnson's optimism in the pessimistic pandemic. But I'm also optimistic that a COVID relief fund will fund our fund, and hope that our passage on Monday of the resolution will help that move along. I just wanted to just note that I think it's problematic for me a little bit here, just hearing that the two kind of, so with the two items that are moving forward, the one from El Centro and the We Are the Ones, I do want some parity there, and acknowledging that they're both doing similar work, and acknowledging that that sends a very disproportionate message. And so I know that the ambassadors may not be full-time staff specifically, but that would be the hope, I think, from the conversations I've had with folks. And if one is moving forward as a pilot, why is the other not moving forward as a pilot?
So, I'll only say that the We Are the One fund was proposed as a 2-year proposal. That doesn't mean it couldn't continue, but I think that's why it's listed as a one-time expenditure now. Same with the DEER program. The DEER program is, it could be another year of transitional funding also after this year, but it's listed that way because it was just proposed as a, something that's not recurring.
And I could add a little bit of context to that. Also, I think a lot of the genesis for the We Are the Ones team to kind of coalesce was really related to COVID relief and the ways in which the virus was disproportionately impacting Black communities and violence in our communities. So I was just emailing some of these questions to the folks that are involved in designing that program. And so those questions will be in there, and I'll get I'll help rally some response next week to everybody. I'll CC the whole council on feedback from that, because I agree. Yeah, like the DEER program. In fact, that was even or was it not DEER? It was what was it? You just said it. The school thing where we were helping with the
learning centers.
Yeah, the learning centers. What was that called? It was called the
Hope Learning Center.
Hope Learning Centers. Okay, yeah. That was even, in the initial discussions, that was kind of looked at as kind of a model for an unusual for city council, at least, to kind of jump into the education space, which is in the county domain, pulling from temporary funds. I think that scope could expand, especially as we look at what's happening with the Safety and Wellness Task Force, to permanently include something like the ambassador program, as Charlie, mentioned, in a context of a broader developing approach to public safety. But at its genesis, that's why it was kind of proposed in the shorter term as opposed to the longer term.
I appreciate that. I think I'm a little bit concerned because I also hear very frequently how when we set up these pilots and they're part-time with no benefits, it's harder for it to move and actually do the things we want it to do, or have the people in it that need to be in it. And so I'm just raising a concern. I realize we cut back the 250 to 62 and just making it just feeling like a little bit of a shift too far, and just acknowledging that it could be in parity with El Centro and just be an ongoing ambassador program, acknowledging that we can review it in 2 years and still have the same, level of consistency there. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else, colleagues? Councilmember Reese.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can you refresh my recollection about what we agreed on with a head nod about our travel budget for the next fiscal year?
I would say that we agreed that we're going to look at it. And
Okay.
that if we make any changes to it, and if we add to it, we'll need to cut somewhere else in the council's budget so that we can get down to our 3% cuts.
Okay, great.
Let me just say, I agreed to that, but I didn't hear any opposition.
Well,
No
I just
one-
want to say,
I think everybody's good with that. I think we all want to have our 3% in there. Yeah.
yeah. So I just wanted to say, on behalf of on my own behalf, I know that that we have asked some of our colleagues to take on some more broader responsibilities to represent us in some of these national organizations, and I think that makes us less similarly situated than we might otherwise be with respect to at least the travel part of our budget. And so in that respect, I've always been very eager to support my colleagues in doing the things that we've asked them to do by transferring money from my allocation, and continue to be happy to do that. If we need to get down to a certain number, I'll do everything I can to make sure that folks get where they need to be. So just wanted to say that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to send this out. Madam Clerk or I will send it out. People can review it and see what we think. Councilmember Middleton.
Thanks. I want to thank my colleague Charlie and indeed confirm he indeed is incredibly collegial in that area, and I want to acknowledge it fully and thank him for his continued cooperation and spirit of sharing to make sure we all do what we need to do. So thanks to that. And I'm recalling the conversation now about the travel budget. I certainly wasn't looking for us to increase it. I was just looking for, just keep it where it is. So there was no increase, but I certainly recognize the importance of us anteing up as well, being at the top of the org chart, and still support that. And again, we don't know what's going to happen, but in the eventuality that things do open up, we certainly want to be prepared to honor our commitments. And I thank Councilor Reese for Charlie for his commitment to that. I did want to say something about what Deidreana said, and kind of piggybacking off of what my query about the appropriation for El Centro being recurring, which in effect essentially makes it a line item for the city. Let me be clearly transparent. The leadership of El Centro are personal friends of mine, and work closely with them over the years. When I work with Durham Can, I think they're one of the most impactful organizations in this city, and much of our fabric of who we are as a city is contributed to and safeguarded by the work of El Centro. But I want to underscore what Deidreana is pointing out, that it may be precedent establishing, and that if there are organizations in the future that are non-endorsing, they're not political or overtly political in nature, but the scope of their work deals with a particular segment, which is important and critical to the work of our city, but not everybody may be able to avail themselves of the services they offer, that we're going to have to be in a position to say, why them and not you? And hear me well, I totally support the appropriation, because I'm a huge fan of El Centro. And I will war against anybody who tries to exacerbate any Black and brown struggle or tries to pit Black and brown against one another. We got too much work and too many common enemies for that. But I think we ought to take Deidreana's admonition seriously, because I can clearly see us getting into a position sometime in the future where another organization or entity comes along that's just as vested, just as much part of the fabric of Durham, who does important work for a particular demographic that is important and beloved, but is particular, who wants line item status as well from the city. And I think we need to be prepared for that discussion and for those considerations. I think inevitable discussions and considerations moving forward by crossing this threshold. With that said, I'm very proud to support, I think, one of the most important, impactful organizations in our city, in El Centro. So just want to align myself with Deidreana's comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Caballero.
So I'm confused. Is it reoccurring, or is that just, yes? Okay. So because now I'm really confused, because I had put it in the reoccurring in my scoring, but then the staff memo said it was one time, but it's not.
The El Centro is recurring.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I just want to highlight for folks, Latinos are also Black. So we just have to remember that as well. I know we have a very, while we do get a predominant section of Latinos in Durham that, you know, while El Centro serves Latino community, they also serve Black Latinos and US Black folks because some of their programming does that. So happy to help get that this is now a recurring line item. So I appreciate that. But I did want to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. And let me fully, absolutely. And I'm so glad you made that point. You know, the diaspora of Black folk, you know, we're Latino, we're gay, we're everything. Absolutely. But this is Durham. And there are some groups in this city, we're going to have that conversation because there are groups who will be able to say, you know, well, there are also Latinx folks in our sphere of influence as well. Make me a line item. And I just, you know, I fully endorse and love the work of El Centro, but I think Deidreana's statements should be taken seriously because, you know, we all know what we can read the greens in our city. We know the various groups we have in our city and demographics and making a particular group a line item is a threshold that if we cross with this group, we're going to have to be prepared. Everything you said, we're going to have to be able to say to other groups as well, because those conversations are coming. But your point is well taken. Absolutely. Of course, Black folk are Latino and Latino Black folk as well. Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Councilmember Freeman.
Thank you. And I do appreciate that as well, Councilmember Caballero, because I don't want it to appear as if I'm parsing it out by Black or Latino. It's really around organizationally, just acknowledging that DCI could very well have requested to be a line item for youth programming or, you know, early childhood programming, and just acknowledging that whatever the threshold is needs to be clear and consistent. And so acknowledging that we are the ones doesn't quite fit in that same realm in this conversation because of X, Y, and Z that we've in the previous conversation that we had. I also note that the organizations who all were included in that conversation were all Black led. And so that specific distinction is clear to the folks in the community as we acknowledge that the folks who are leading the El Centro are Spanish speaking or of a Latinx or Latin descent. And it's all convoluted, but making sure that it's clear why that distinction is made where it's full-time FTE line item in our budget this year with no prerequisite, you know, RFP or any conversations prior to a submitted item by a council member, and another council member submits a similar situation and it ends up being a reoccurring 2-year limitation. And so I appreciate Pierce spelling out that he made the request that it was a 2-year limitation and not that it was something that staff made the decision on.
Thank you. Other comments? All right, Bertha.
Thank you, Mayor. We've had a lot of great discussion today and our last other 3 days. I don't anticipate or expect that everyone will remember all the discussions and ask all of their questions today. Please remember that we're here for you. If you have questions, follow-up questions from the presentations, from the discussions, please share those with us. If you expect some follow-up from us, the staff is capturing the notes, but feel free to share those with us as well. You know, hey, we requested this information. Just want to make sure that you heard that request. We're happy to do that as well. I just want to thank the budget staff as they pop up on the screen for all the work they've done to get us to this point. We still have a ways to go. We will be back with you again at the March 18th work session to talk about the guidelines. We can certainly have discussions about other items at that time. We have some time in between today and then to bring forward anything else that needs to come before you. With that said, thanks again to the budget staff. They've worked really hard on this, and it has been challenging in this format more than I anticipated. So thanks to my team, and I will turn it over to Interim City Manager Wanda Page for her comments.
Before we do that, can I just ask you to remind us, Bertha, about our upcoming budget schedule?
So our upcoming budget schedule, we have, again, I just mentioned that date. We have our, you mean in terms of what's on the remaining dates on the calendar? Okay, so we have a public hearing scheduled. We have a CAN event scheduled for, I believe, March 3rd. I don't have that in front of me, John, correct me if I'm- March 3rd, that is our first engagement activities. We've also reached out to some other groups to set up some additional engagement activities with those groups. Those will be focused on education, as well as giving them some opportunity to give us some information about their priorities while being transparent about where we are in the process, that we really are focused on what we're going to do next year in the fall in terms of engagement. We will have our council work sessions on the budget on May 27th and May 28th. We have a follow-up day scheduled for May 4th. And of course, prior to that, the city manager will present the budget on Monday, May 18th to the city council and the community, and you're scheduled to adopt the budget on June 15th. Of course, it has to be adopted by June 30th. There will be some other opportunities for engagement with our community. We haven't scheduled all of those at this point, but we will certainly share those with you as well. Keep in mind, Andrew Holland dropped in, our engagement manager dropped in the chat yesterday. Our PB process is also, that application process is open. So please refer any of the nonprofit and community organizations to that process who come to you, because we want to make sure that our organizations take advantage of all the opportunities that are out there for them. So you can go to PB Durham website and get that information. We've had several meetings with nonprofit organizations, much interest in the program. So we're really excited about that. So those are the dates we have. We can drop out on if you go to the City of Durham's webpage, go to Budget and Management Services. We have all of the presentations that we've done today, as well as the budget schedule, and any information we bring forward to you, we put it on our website so that our residents can have access to that information.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So we have some other shots at this, and you all will guide us and tell us when we take them.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, Madam Manager.
All right. Thank you, Mayor. I would say today has been another good day. We've discussed some very important topics, and as Bertha Johnson has stated, intense topics and policy matters that will have a great impact on the future of our city. And I always like to remind everyone that even though for the budget department, budget is all year round, but for many of us, the budget season kicks off the first week of January for most of our departments, where it's at top of mind. And we're working on and thinking about the budget development pretty much every day, along with all of the other operational matters that we have to take care of in this, continuously changing and complex environment that we work in, especially this year during COVID and COVID recovery. But I do want to assure the council and the community that is listening, we are bringing our best to all of this work. And I won't belabor it, but I just wanted to say it in this setting. These last 4 sessions have really provided us much guidance for progressing toward a budget proposal, and we appreciate it. We will continue to provide you all advance notice of when we will be discussing what we kind of call budget related items at upcoming work sessions, so that you can kind of be prepared for those, including water rate presentations, our affordable housing plan, some of those bigger things that impact our work and sort of are linked to budget in some ways, but certainly our investments and our operations. And as has been said here numerous times, the guidelines will be back. It will be more informed and a little more finalized to City Council at the March 18th work session, along with anything else that the council decides we need to have a little bit more discussion about during that time. And again, I would just like to thank the staff that are still here today for just being here, being attentive, thinking of what you're going to do, texting me during the meeting, giving me information that might be helpful to respond to questions. I really, really appreciate all of the teamwork, all of the collaboration. I thank you today. I thank you every day for the excellent work that you do for this organization and for this community. Thank you, Mayor and Council.
Awesome. I just will just thank our budget staff again. It was great to see everybody's faces, and just we miss you. We love seeing you in person, and next year we're going to have this in person. We're going to be having lunch together. I'm going to be able to, I love seeing all the department directors at this event. I just want all our department directors who were here to know that we miss you. We really miss seeing you and being with you. We love you, we respect you, and mainly we're grateful to you for the amazing work that you do. All right, colleagues, we have 2 minutes. So if anybody has 30 seconds of comments, I'm happy to take them. Councilmember Freeman.
30 seconds of comments. I just really want to thank you all. I appreciate, especially my colleagues here, always making sure to clarify the points. And I think this budget season has run a whole lot smoother than in the past. I'm afraid the Zoom might be the best way to do this, so even though we like being in person. But I just really think this budget cycle, I mean, we're in a very precarious situation with the pandemic and, not knowing what's going to happen in the future. But I do feel very confident that we'll come to a good budget and move forward as we always do. So thank you. 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. Anything further, colleagues? We will let Councilmember Freeman's excellent words be the last words. And I guess we have a meeting do we have a meeting on Monday night then? We all have to be ready for. I will look forward to seeing you all on Monday night. Much gratitude to our staff, especially our budget and finance folks. Awesome job. And we'll see you on Monday. This meeting is now adjourned.